The box was small and square, wrapped in plain brown paper and tied with twine. It sat on the kitchen counter when I came home, as unassuming as a loaf of bread. No name, no address, just the faint smell of cedar and an air of quiet mystery. "Did you order something?" I called out to him, holding it up as he walked in from the living room. He glanced at the box, then shook his head. "Not me. Probably one of those weird neighbor mix-ups again." The neighbors weren't the type to misplace packages. Mr. Hargrove next door kept meticulous lists of every delivery, and the couple on the other side rarely ordered anything that didn't come in glossy branded boxes. But I let it go, setting the package back on the counter. It wasn't until the next morning, after he'd left for work, that curiosity got the better of me. I untied the twine, peeling back the paper with care. Inside was a tin, a deep navy blue, embossed with swirling gold patterns. I pried off the lid and found a stack of Polaroids. The first photo showed a pair of hands holding a ceramic mug, steam curling upward like a ghost. The second was a set of intertwined fingers resting on a picnic blanket. By the third, I felt my chest tighten. A photo of him, unmistakably him, smiling at someone just outside the frame. The woman in the next photo wasn't me. She sat on a bench, her head tilted back in laughter, her eyes hidden behind oversized sunglasses. In the background, there was a park I didn't recognize, with cherry blossoms blooming in soft pink clouds. The tin clattered to the counter as I stepped back, my breath caught in my throat. For a long moment, I just stood there, staring at the photos spilling across the countertop. When he came home that night, I didn't say anything. The tin was back where I'd found it, the paper carefully rewrapped, and I watched him over dinner as he talked about work. His laugh came easily, his movements were relaxed, and yet, something felt rehearsed. The following weekend, I decided to ask directly. We were in the garden, pulling weeds from the flower beds, when I casually mentioned the box. "Did you figure out who it belonged to?" I asked, tossing a clump of dandelions into the bin. "What box?" he said without looking up. "The one on the counter. Brown paper, twine." "Oh, that," he said, his tone too light. "Yeah, I threw it out. Just junk." I nodded, though my hands had stilled in the dirt. "Junk," I repeated. That night, I went through his things. It wasn't something I'd ever done before. His drawers, his desk, his car. Those spaces had always felt sacred, lines I couldn't cross. But now, the line was a suggestion, blurred by the questions piling up in my head. In the glove compartment of his car, I found a second box, identical to the first, wrapped in the same plain brown paper. This time, I opened it immediately. The photos inside were different. There was a restaurant table set with candles and wine, a beach at sunset, and a photo of the same woman from the first box, her head resting on his shoulder. Her smile was soft, almost shy, as though the camera had caught a moment meant to be private. I put everything back exactly as I'd found it, my hands trembling. The next morning, he left early, claiming he had errands to run. I followed him, staying far enough behind that he wouldn't notice my car. He drove to a park on the other side of the city, the kind of hidden gem you'd only know about if someone told you. I parked at a distance, watching as he got out and walked toward a bench near the pond. She was already there. I didn't recognize the way he smiled at her, open and unguarded in a way I hadn't seen in years. They sat close, her arm brushing his, and when she leaned over to whisper something, he laughed, a real, unreserved laugh that carried across the water. I stayed in my car, watching as they shared a thermos of something warm. When he came home that night, I was waiting in the living room. "The park looks nice this time of year," I said, my voice even. He froze in the doorway, his keys clinking softly as they hit the table. "What?" I said. "The park looks nice. Cherry blossoms, warm thermos, good company." His face shifted, the confusion melting into something closer to fear. "Who is she?" I asked. He didn't deny it. He sat down on the edge of the couch, his hands clasped tightly between his knees. "Her name is Amelia," he said quietly. "How long?" 5 months. The words hit harder than I expected. I pressed my palms into my thighs to keep from shaking. "And me? Where do I fit into all this?" He looked at me, his eyes heavy with something I couldn't name. I don't know. I stood, my movements deliberate, and walked to the kitchen. I returned with the tin, setting it down on the coffee table between us. "Take this with you when you leave." "Please," he said, his voice cracking. "It's not." "It's over," I interrupted, my tone sharper than I intended. He left that night, the tin tucked under his arm, and I sat in the garden until the sun rose, the cool air brushing against my skin. Weeks later, a package arrived. It was wrapped in plain brown paper, tied with twine. I almost didn't open it, but when I did, I found a single Polaroid inside. It was a photo of the garden, our garden, bathed in the warm light of sunset. On the back, he'd written 2 words, "I'm sorry." I put the photo in the drawer by the kitchen window, and that evening, I planted something new in the flower bed. The past has its place, but the future always blooms. The invitation arrived on a Monday. It wasn't a formal letter or an email, just a plain envelope slipped under my apartment door. No name, no return address. Inside was a single card, black with silver lettering that shimmered faintly in the dim light. "You are cordially invited to an evening at the Hall of Mirrors. Saturday, 9 p.m. One guest only. Address below." There was no RSVP information, no details about who had sent it. The address listed was unfamiliar, and when I checked it on my phone, it didn't appear on any map. At first, I thought it was a prank, some elaborate joke played by someone who'd forgotten to include a punchline. I tossed the card on my coffee table and went about my day. But as the week went on, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Something about the card, its weight, its texture, the strange shimmer of the letters, felt deliberate, almost alive. By Friday, I'd convinced myself to go. What harm could it do? The night of the invitation, I drove out to the address. The road twisted through unfamiliar neighborhoods, the kind of place where streetlights flickered or didn't exist at all. My GPS gave up halfway there, but I didn't need it. The Hall of Mirrors revealed itself as though it had been waiting. The building was old, but not in the way most abandoned places were. It wasn't crumbling or overgrown. Instead, it was pristine, with tall black columns and wide double doors that gleamed under the moonlight. The windows reflected the night too perfectly, like pools of still water. I parked my car and approached the doors, unsure of what I was doing there. As soon as I touched the handle, the doors swung open silently. The air inside was cool, faintly perfumed with something floral I couldn't name. The entryway was grand, polished marble floors, high ceilings, and walls lined with mirrors. No people, no sound. I called out, my voice echoing faintly. No answer. The mirrors caught my attention immediately. They weren't normal. The reflections were sharp, too sharp, as though the glass was amplifying every detail. My face looked almost alien under their scrutiny. Too many pores, too many flaws, all magnified into something grotesque. The invitation had said 9 p.m. I checked my watch. It was 8:59. When the second hand ticked over to 9 o'clock, the doors behind me slammed shut. I spun around, heart racing, but the entryway was empty. And then the lights flickered. One by one, the mirrors began to shift. It wasn't immediate, more like the subtlest distortion, the glass rippling as though it were water disturbed by a breeze. The reflections within didn't match reality anymore. In the mirror nearest to me, my reflection was smiling. I wasn't. The smile was too wide, stretching until it no longer fit my face. The teeth were wrong, sharp, jagged, glinting faintly in the dim light. I backed away, but my reflection didn't follow. Instead, it leaned closer to the glass, pressing its hands against the inside of the mirror as though testing its strength. The other mirrors began to change, too. In one, I saw myself walking toward a darkened doorway that didn't exist in the real room. In another, I was sitting on the floor, my face buried in my hands, rocking back and forth. But the worst was the mirror directly ahead of me. It didn't show me at all. The reflection was of the room, but empty. No furniture, no me, just a vast, hollow space. The walls were darker, the corners stretching endlessly into shadow. I turned, desperate to leave, but the doors had disappeared. The mirrors whispered now. The sound was faint at first, like wind brushing against the edges of consciousness. But it grew louder, the words overlapping and indistinct, each one tugging at a part of my mind I didn't recognize. Stay. Look closer. We know you. The mirror in front of me rippled violently, the glass warping as though something on the other side was trying to push through. I took a step back, then another, but the room seemed to tilt, pulling me closer. When the glass finally shattered, there was no sound. It fell inward, pieces vanishing into the darkness beyond. And from that darkness, something stepped out. It was me, or almost me. The same face, the same clothes, but wrong in ways that I couldn't name. Its movements were too fluid, its eyes too bright, its mouth still stretched into that impossible grin. It tilted its head, studying me, as though deciding something. Then it spoke, in a voice that wasn't mine but carried an echo of familiarity. Your turn. Before I could react, it reached out, its hand cold and impossibly strong. The mirrors around me erupted in a cacophony of motion and light, each one reflecting fragments of me, of it, of the room twisting and breaking apart. And then, silence. Now I'm here. I don't know how long I've been in this place. The hall of mirrors doesn't seem to have an end, just endless corridors and infinite reflections. Sometimes I catch glimpses of people through the glass, strangers who look into mirrors and linger just a moment too long. I wonder if they can see me, staring back. I wonder if they'll take my place. The invitation will find them, too. It always does. The train station didn't exist on any map. At least, not anymore. Lila stumbled across it while walking home from her night shift, the sky heavy with the muted gray of pre-dawn. She hadn't planned to take the long route, but the streets had felt suffocating, too many empty windows staring back at her like vacant eyes. So she turned down an unfamiliar road, one she couldn't remember seeing before. That was when she found it. The sign above the entrance read Arden Station, the letters faint and peeling, and the structure itself looked like it had been abandoned for decades. Ivy crept up the cracked stone walls, and the roof sagged slightly, as if under the weight of years. Yet, faintly, she could hear the low, rhythmic hum of a train engine, distant but unmistakable. She should have kept walking, but something about the place held her. It wasn't curiosity. She was too tired for that. It was more like recognition. Her feet carried her forward before her mind could catch up. The door, heavy and iron-bound, groaned as she pushed it open. The interior was dim, the air thick with the scent of damp wood and rusting metal. The ticket counter was empty, its glass smeared and cloudy. Faint footsteps echoed somewhere deeper inside, though the station seemed deserted. At the far end of the platform, a train sat waiting. It was an old model, the kind she'd only seen in black and white photographs, with narrow windows and a polished brass nameplate that read the Arboris line. Steam hissed softly from beneath it, curling into the cool air. Lila hesitated. There was no conductor, no passengers, no sign of life apart from the quiet thrum of the engine. The train's door was open, as if inviting her aboard. Just a peek, she muttered to herself, though the words felt hollow. She stepped inside. The interior was pristine, the kind of careful craftsmanship that didn't exist anymore. Mahogany panels lined the walls, and the seats were upholstered in deep green velvet. A faint golden light filtered through the windows, though outside the station, the world seemed darker than it should have been. The train jolted slightly, the floor shifting beneath her feet. The hum of the engine grew louder, and before she could react, the doors hissed shut. "Wait," she started, but the train was already moving. She stumbled into a seat, gripping the edge of the table in front of her as the motion steadied. Through the window, the world outside blurred into streaks of gray and black, shapes that twisted and writhed in ways that didn't seem entirely natural. There was no announcement, no sign of a destination. Only the steady rhythm of the wheels on the track and the growing sense that the train wasn't taking her anywhere she wanted to go. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice uncertain in the stillness. "Is anyone here?" A soft creak answered her, the sound of a door opening further down the car. She turned sharply, her pulse quickening. A man stood in the aisle, though man didn't feel quite right. He was tall, his frame almost too slender, and his features were sharp to the point of being unsettling. His skin was pale, his eyes a shade of gray that seemed to drink in the dim light. He wore a long coat, its edges frayed, and in his hand was a pocket watch that ticked far too fast. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice smooth and quiet, like the whisper of wind through a keyhole. "I didn't mean to," Lila started, but he raised a hand to silence her. "It doesn't matter now," he said, stepping closer. "The arborist line doesn't stop for mistakes." "What is this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Where are we going?" He tilted his head, studying her as if deciding how much she deserved to know. "The line goes where it's needed," he said, "and where it's owed." "Owed?" He didn't answer. Instead, he gestured to the seat across from her. "Sit." "I'm already sitting." "Good," he said with the faintest trace of a smile. "Then listen." The train jolted again, and the windows darkened. Outside, shadows moved, tall and spindly, their forms flickering like candle flames caught in a draft. The rhythm of the wheels changed, the sound now uneven, almost like a heartbeat. "You took a wrong turn," the man said, his eyes never leaving hers. "Or perhaps the right one. It's hard to say. Who are you?" "A guide," he said. "Nothing more." "A guide to what?" He leaned forward, his long fingers drumming softly against the table. "You already know." She didn't, but as the words sank in, something stirred in the back of her mind. A memory, not clear, not complete, but heavy and cold, like a stone dropped into deep water. She tried to grab hold of it, but it slipped away. "You made a bargain once," the man said, his voice lower now, almost kind. "And bargains must be honored." "I didn't," she started, but the words caught in her throat. The train slowed, the wheels screeching faintly as it pulled into a station. The platform outside was nothing like the one she'd left behind. This place was vast, its edges swallowed by shadow. Pale lights flickered above, casting uneven pools of brightness over the figures waiting there. They weren't people. Not exactly. They moved slowly, their forms shifting and incomplete, like sketches abandoned before the details were finished. Their faces were blank, their limbs long and thin. They didn't turn to look at her, but she felt their awareness pressing against her, heavy and cold. The door hissed open. "This is your stop," the man said, rising to his feet. Lila stayed frozen in her seat. "I don't want to get off." He smiled faintly. "No one ever does." The figures outside began to move, their heads tilting toward the train as though sensing her hesitation. The air grew colder, the shadows stretching toward the door like fingers. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. The man stepped aside, gesturing toward the open door. "It's not about what you want. It's about what you owe." She didn't move. The figures drew closer, their shapes blurring, and the air inside the train seemed to tremble. The man sighed, his smile fading. "If you stay," he said, "the train will take its due instead." The meaning of his words settled over her like a weight, and with a shuddering breath, she stood. Her legs felt weak, but she forced herself to step forward, toward the figures waiting on the platform. As her foot crossed the threshold, the man spoke one last time. "Perhaps next time, you'll remember." The door slid shut behind her, and the train began to move. The platform stretched endlessly around her, the figures circling closer, their forms shifting and whispering in words she couldn't understand. And far in the distance, the faint sound of a train whistle echoed once more. When I was 11, my grandfather told me something strange. "Don't go into the woods at night. That's when the forest listens." At the time, I thought it was one of those ominous things old people say to make the world feel bigger and scarier than it actually is. But now, years later, I understand. Last month, I moved back to the small town where I grew up. It wasn't by choice. My job had dried up, my lease had expired, and I had nowhere else to go. The only thing waiting for me was my grandfather's house, untouched since his death 5 years ago. Its exterior faded and its windows clouded with dust. The woods hadn't changed. His backyard still sloped gently down to the edge of the tree line, where the towering pines and tangled brush seemed to beckon and repel at the same time. As a child, I'd avoided them out of respect for his rule. Now, I avoided them because of the stories I'd heard growing up. Hunters who got lost and never returned, animals found mangled in ways no predator could explain, strange lights flickering between the trees. On my second night back, I heard it. I was lying in bed, trying to block out the hum of cicadas, when a low, rhythmic sound drifted in through the open window. It wasn't a noise I recognized. Half whistle, half hum, rising and falling in uneven bursts. It didn't sound mechanical or like any animal I knew. It was closer to a voice, but not quite. The sound came from the woods. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of the wind, the echo of some distant bird, but it didn't stop. The next night, it came again. This time, it was closer. I stood at the window, staring out at the dark line of trees, trying to convince myself that the sound wasn't directed at me. But the longer I listened, the more certain I became that it wasn't random. There was a rhythm to it, deliberate and strange, like a call waiting for a response. The third night, I answered. It wasn't bravery or stupidity that drove me. It was curiosity, plain and simple, the kind that gnaws at you until it can't be ignored. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, the damp grass cold against my bare feet. The woods loomed larger up close, the shadows between the trees alive with faint motion. The sound was louder now, coming from somewhere deep within, its rhythm faster, more urgent. I should have turned back. Instead, I stepped over the edge of the tree line. The air changed immediately. It was cooler, heavier, carrying a faint metallic tang that made my stomach turn. The flashlight's beams sliced through the darkness, but it felt weak, like the trees absorbed the light before it could reach the ground. The sound drew me forward. As I walked, the trees closed in, their branches weaving together to form a canopy so dense that even the stars disappeared. My footsteps were muffled by a thick carpet of moss, and the only sound was that low, rising hum, closer now, almost vibrating in my chest. I don't know how long I walked. Time felt different in the woods, stretched and compressed in ways I couldn't explain. I stopped when I reached the clearing. It wasn't a clearing in the traditional sense. There was no grass, no open sky, just a wide circle where the trees had bent inward, their trunks twisting unnaturally, their branches forming a lattice above. The ground was bare and smooth, as though something had swept it clean, and in the center, there was a hole. It was perfectly round, about 6 feet across, and so dark that the flashlight's beams seemed to vanish into it. The hum came from there, rising up in waves that made the ground tremble beneath my feet. I should have left. Instead, I leaned closer. The darkness in the hole wasn't empty. It rippled, like water disturbed by an unseen current. Shapes moved beneath the surface, shadows darker than the dark, flickering in and out of existence. I dropped a small stone into the hole. It didn't make a sound, and then the hum stopped. The silence was absolute, pressing against my ears like a physical weight. I stumbled back, suddenly aware of how loud my breathing was. Then something moved. The hole wasn't empty anymore. A hand emerged first, long, thin fingers tipped with points that weren't quite nails. Then another and another, until too many hands were clawing at the edges, pulling something up. I froze as a shape began to rise, its form indistinct, its surface shifting like smoke caught in a jar. It was tall, impossibly tall, and as it unfurled, it leaned forward, bending toward me. It didn't have a face, but I felt its gaze. The flashlight slipped from my hand, clattering against the ground. The thing tilted its head, and a sound filled the air. Not the hum, but something worse. It was a voice, low and guttural, speaking words I didn't understand. I didn't need to. It wanted me to run, and so I did. I ran blindly, the trees clawing at my arms and legs, the ground shifting beneath my feet. The sound followed me, growing louder, faster, until it was everywhere, in my ears, in my head, pounding against my skull. When I burst out of the tree line, the night was quiet again. I locked the doors and shut the windows, but I knew it wouldn't matter. I haven't slept since. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I hear it, the hum, soft and distant, calling me back to the woods. And I know one day I'll answer. The first time I noticed the staircase, I wasn't supposed to be there. The building was an old office complex downtown, abandoned for years, but still standing like a forgotten sentinel. I'd been hired to photograph the interior for a developer, someone who wanted to tear it down and build something shinier, sleeker, and far less interesting. The floors creaked underfoot as I moved through the hushed, empty hallways. Dust motes swirled in the dim light, streaming through grime-coated windows. Every corner of the place felt heavy, as though the air itself was weighed down by the years. It was beautiful in its decay, a kind of fragile dignity that made you feel like you were intruding on something private. The blueprint the developer had sent me didn't match what I saw. Certain rooms were larger than they should have been. Hallways stretched a little farther than I expected. But it wasn't until I reached the third floor that I realized something was very wrong. I was taking pictures of what used to be an open-plan office space when I noticed it. A narrow staircase tucked into the far corner of the room. It was unremarkable, just a plain set of steps made from the same faded wood as the floorboards. But it shouldn't have been there. I double-checked the blueprint. The third floor was supposed to end at that wall. There was no mention of a staircase, no indication that there was even space for one. Yet there it was, solid and unmistakable. I took a photo, the click of the shutter echoing through the silence. The staircase seemed to draw me closer, though I couldn't say why. Something about its presence was magnetic, the kind of thing that commands your attention even when you want to look away. Without really thinking, I climbed the first step. The wood groaned under my weight, but held firm. I paused, waiting for something, but the building stayed silent. No wind through the windows, no scurrying rats in the walls. Just my own breath, loud and uneven in the stillness. The staircase spiraled upward, narrowing as it rose. The air grew cooler with each step, the walls closing in until I felt like I was climbing into the throat of some ancient beast. I counted the steps as I went, more out of nervousness than anything else. By the time I reached 40, I knew something was wrong. There was no way the building could accommodate a staircase this tall. From the outside, the structure was only 4 stories high, and I'd already climbed well beyond that. My legs ached, and my breath came in shallow gasps, but I couldn't stop. The air smelled faintly of rust and something sharper, like burnt hair. The walls seemed to pulse, their faded wallpaper curling inward as though drawing me deeper. At the top of the stairs, I found a door. It was plain, unpainted wood with no handle or keyhole, just a smooth surface that somehow felt wrong in its simplicity. I raised a hand to knock, then hesitated. My knuckles hovered an inch from the wood as I strained to listen. There was something on the other side. A faint sound, like whispering, too soft to make out. The door felt warm under my palm, a gentle thrum pulsing against my skin. It reminded me of touching the hood of a car just after the engine's been shut off. Alive, but barely. I don't know how long I stood there. It could have been minutes or hours. Eventually, I turned and made my way back down the stairs, my footsteps quicker now, each creak of the wood sounding like a warning. When I reached the bottom, I stepped into the room I'd come from, only to find it wasn't the same. The furniture was different, bulkier, older, as though from a time decades before the building had been abandoned. Dust coated everything, thick and undisturbed, and the air carried a faint metallic tang that hadn't been there before. I turned to the staircase, but it was gone. In its place was a solid wall, the wood paneling seamless and unbroken. Panic surged through me. I tried to retrace my steps, but the hallway I'd entered through was no longer there. Instead, the room stretched endlessly in every direction, its edges fading into shadow. The more I moved, the farther the walls seemed to retreat, the space expanding around me like a lung inhaling. And then I saw them. Figures, just on the edge of my vision, moving in the shadows. They didn't walk so much as glide, their limbs bending in ways that made my stomach turn. They stayed just out of reach, their forms flickering like static on an old TV screen. I backed away, but there was no escape. The room shifted around me, the shadows deepening until I couldn't tell where the figures ended and the darkness began. The whispering returned, louder this time. The words were still indistinct, but their tone was unmistakable. Insistent, urgent, and somehow angry. I pressed my hands over my ears, but the sound only grew louder, filling my head until I thought it might split open. When I opened my eyes again, I was back in the third-floor office space. The staircase was gone, and the room was as it had been when I first entered, empty, decaying, and silent. My camera hung from its strap around my neck, and when I checked the photos, the staircase was there, solid and real. But in every shot, the shadows seemed to gather at the edges, curling toward the stairs like they were reaching for it. I sent the photos to the developer, along with a curt message saying I wouldn't be returning. He called me a few days later, his voice tense. "The staircase," he said. "Where is it?" I tried to explain that it wasn't there anymore, that it had disappeared the moment I left. He didn't believe me. "That room doesn't exist," he said. "We've looked. The blueprints don't show anything like it. I don't know what's worse, that I saw something I can't explain, or that somewhere, in the bones of that old building, the staircase might still be waiting. Sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I hear the whispers again, faint, insistent, calling me back." The invitation arrived on an ordinary Tuesday, slipped beneath my door in a heavy black envelope with no return address. I almost didn't notice it, thinking it was junk mail. But as I picked it up, the weight of it felt significant, deliberate. The paper inside was thick and smooth, with raised silver lettering that glinted faintly in the light. "You are cordially invited to an exclusive evening at the Hollow House. 8 p.m. sharp. Come alone. No RSVP. No explanation. Just a time, a place, and a command." I should have ignored it. The invitation had the air of something meant for someone else. One of those rich, secretive clubs or gatherings where people wore masks and whispered in hushed tones. But curiosity has always been my weakness. The name Hollow House tugged at something buried deep in my memory, a faint recognition I couldn't place. By 7:45 that evening, I was in my car, heading toward the outskirts of the city. The directions were straightforward, though they led me down roads I didn't recognize. The further I drove, the fewer streetlights there were, until the world outside my car became a blur of trees and shadows. The Hollow House appeared suddenly, perched at the top of a hill like it had grown there. It was a sprawling, Gothic mansion, its silhouette sharp and jagged against the night sky. The windows were dark, save for one, where a faint flicker of golden light beckoned. The invitation hadn't lied about exclusivity. There were no other cars in the gravel driveway, no signs of life apart from the occasional rustle of wind through the surrounding woods. I hesitated at the door. It was massive, carved with intricate patterns that looked like writhing branches or veins, depending on how the light hit them. Before I could knock, the door swung inward silently, revealing a grand foyer lit by dozens of flickering candles. No one greeted me. The air inside was cold, carrying a faint scent of old wood and something sharper, like burnt herbs. The room was empty, but a narrow hallway stretched ahead, its walls lined with portraits. I stepped inside, and the door closed behind me with a heavy thud. The portraits were strange. At first glance, they seemed like typical oil paintings of stern-faced men and women in formal attire. But as I moved down the hallway, their eyes seemed to follow me, their expressions shifting ever so slightly. One woman's lips curved into a faint smile as I passed, and a man in the next frame tilted his head, his gaze narrowing. At the end of the hallway was a door, slightly ajar. Beyond it was a parlor, its walls lined with bookshelves that stretched to the ceiling. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the room. And in the center of the room was a table. 5 chairs surrounded it, 4 of them occupied by figures who didn't look up as I entered. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothing, formal suits and dresses that looked like they belonged to another century. Their faces were obscured by elaborate masks, each one shaped like an animal: a fox, a raven, a stag, and a wolf. The 5th chair was empty. "Please," the figure in the fox mask said, gesturing to the chair. Their voice was soft, but it carried an undertone that made my skin prickle. "Sit." I hesitated, but the weight of their collective gaze pressed down on me. I moved to the chair and sat. "Good," the raven said, their mask tilting as they regarded me. You're right on time. For what? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. They didn't answer. Instead, the wolf reached into their jacket and produced a deck of cards. The cards were old, their edges frayed, and the designs on their backs were intricate, swirling patterns of gold and black. The wolf shuffled them with a practiced ease, the sound sharp in the silence. When they finished, they placed the deck in the center of the table. Draw, the stag said, their voice low and resonant. What is this? I asked, my heart pounding. The fox leaned forward, their mask glinting in the firelight. The game, they said simply. I didn't move. The raven tilted their head. You were invited. That means you agreed. I didn't agree to anything, I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. The fox's gaze didn't waver. Draw. My hand moved on its own, reaching for the deck. The cards were cool to the touch, their surface smoother than any paper should have been. I drew the top card and turned it over. It was blank. The fox's mask shifted, the corners of its mouth seeming to curl upward. Interesting, they murmured. What does it mean? I asked, my voice trembling. The raven leaned closer, their presence suffocating. It means you've been chosen. The fire dimmed suddenly, the room plunging into an oppressive darkness. The figures around the table remained visible, their masks glowing faintly in the dim light. Chosen for what? The stag spoke this time, their voice heavy with finality. To remember. Before I could respond, the blank card in my hand began to change. Words appeared on its surface, scrawled in a jagged, frantic script. The letters burned into my vision, and as I read them, the room around me dissolved. I was standing in a forest. The trees were impossibly tall, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. The ground beneath my feet was soft, and the air was thick with the sound of whispers. Ahead of me, a figure stood. It was me, but it wasn't. The figure turned, their face a perfect mirror of mine, their expression cold and empty. You left us here, they said, their voice echoing through the trees. I don't understand, I said, my words faltering. You will, they replied, stepping closer. The ground shifted beneath me, and the forest dissolved into darkness. When I woke, I was back in my apartment. The invitation was gone, but the card remained, sitting on the table where the black envelope had been. The words on it had changed. This is only the beginning. Now, every time I close my eyes, I see the figures from the table, their masks, their eyes, and somewhere, in the distance, I hear the sound of shuffling cards. I used to take the late train home every night after work, a routine so familiar it blurred into monotony. The same graffiti-streaked walls of the station, the same dim, flickering lights, the same tired faces of other passengers, and the same metallic groan of the train arriving to whisk us all home. It was comforting in its predictability, until it wasn't. It was a Wednesday when I first noticed the train car wasn't quite the same. I boarded, as always, sliding into a seat by the window. The station lights streamed past in their usual staccato flashes, and I leaned my head against the cold glass. Something was different, though. The air inside felt heavier, denser, as if I had stepped into a room that had been sealed for years. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then I noticed the seats. They weren't the usual faux leather benches. These were upholstered in dark, velvety fabric, the kind you'd find in a theater or an old library. The overhead lights were dimmer, casting the car in an amber glow that made everything feel distant, dreamlike. I looked around at the other passengers, wondering if anyone else had noticed. They hadn't. A man in a rumpled suit dozed with his head tilted back, his tie loose around his neck. Across from him, a woman scrolled through her phone, her face illuminated by the pale glow of the screen. Two teenagers sat near the back, whispering and laughing over something on a crumpled piece of paper. The train rumbled on. When we passed the first station without stopping, I sat up straighter. The sign for Maple Station blurred by in a streak of orange and black, but the train didn't slow. No announcement came over the intercom. The woman with the phone didn't look up. The man in the suit didn't stir. "Excuse me," I said, my voice louder than I intended. The woman glanced at me, her expression vaguely annoyed. "What?" Why didn't we stop? She frowned, as if I'd asked her something absurd. We did. No, we didn't. I just saw the station. Look, buddy, I don't know what your deal is, but I need to finish this email. She turned back to her phone. The teenagers were staring at me now, their whispers silenced. I looked out the window again, my pulse quickening. The darkness outside was deeper now, the station lights gone. In their place was something else, faint shapes moving just beyond the glass. Not people, not animals, just shapes, too fluid to pin down. When I turned back, the other passengers had changed. The man in the suit was still there, but his head was tilted at an angle that didn't seem possible, his neck stretched just a bit too long. The woman's face was no longer illuminated by her phone, which had gone dark. She stared at me now, her eyes wide and unblinking. The teenagers were gone. I stood, gripping the pole for balance as the train rattled forward. Where are we going? I demanded. Nobody answered. The air grew colder, biting against my skin. The lights flickered, and for a brief moment, I saw the true faces of the passengers around me. They weren't faces at all. The man's elongated neck twisted toward me, his mouth splitting into a grin that stretched far beyond the edges of his jaw. The woman's eyes weren't eyes anymore, just dark, empty holes that seemed to pull the light in. And then the lights steadied, and they were normal again. I stumbled back, clutching the seat to keep from falling. The train slowed. Outside the window, a station appeared. It wasn't one I recognized. The sign was blank, the platform empty. The shapes outside the glass moved closer, pressing against the window as though trying to see inside. The train doors hissed open. "End of the line," the man said, his voice rasping like dry leaves. He stood, his limbs unfolding too long, too jagged. The woman followed, her movements jerky, unnatural, as though she were a puppet on tangled strings. They stepped off the train, vanishing into the swirling darkness outside. The doors stayed open, waiting. I didn't move. A sound came then, low and rhythmic, like a heartbeat that wasn't mine. The shapes outside shifted faster, more insistently, pressing harder against the glass. "End of the line," a voice repeated. It came from behind me. I turned slowly, and the teenagers were back. But they weren't teenagers anymore. Their faces were wrong, smeared like wet paint, their features slipping and reforming with every second. They stood at the far end of the car, watching me, waiting. The train jerked forward suddenly, the doors slamming shut, and the strange station disappeared into the blackness behind us. When I turned back, the car was empty. The lights flickered again, and I caught my own reflection in the window. For a moment, it wasn't my reflection at all. It was smiling at me. The train hasn't stopped since. The stations we pass aren't real, just fragments of places that don't exist. And the shapes outside are getting closer. Every now and then, I feel the air shift, as though something is sitting down beside me, just out of sight. The passengers are coming back, one by one, and I'm starting to think I'll never get off. The first time I noticed the lights, I thought it was a storm. I was sitting in my living room late one evening, scrolling on my phone, when the power flickered. It wasn't unusual. The wiring in my neighborhood was old, and outages were common enough that I kept a flashlight by the couch. But then, outside the window, a soft glow rippled across the sky. It wasn't lightning. The light didn't flash or fade. It pulsed, slow, deliberate waves of color that shifted between pale blue and green. It was mesmerizing, like watching the northern lights on fast forward. The air felt heavy, charged, and a faint hum buzzed just at the edge of hearing. I stood at the window, staring out at the empty street, trying to figure out where the light was coming from. There was no source, no street lamp or distant spotlight. It was just there, glowing in the darkness. When it finally stopped, the silence felt too deep, like the world had been muted. The next morning, I checked the news for reports of the lights. There was nothing. No one else seemed to have noticed them. I mentioned it to my neighbor, Mrs. Calloway, a spry woman in her 70s who was usually perched at her front window, keeping an eye on the street. She waved me off with a chuckle. "Maybe you dreamed it, dear. Or one of those drones they have now. They're everywhere." But I hadn't dreamed it. That night, the lights returned. This time, they were closer. The colors bled into my apartment, casting strange, flickering shadows on the walls. I tried to ignore them, focusing on the TV, but the hum grew louder, vibrating in my chest like a second heartbeat. I went outside. The air smelled faintly of ozone, sharp and metallic, and the street was bathed in an eerie glow. The lights seemed to gather at the end of the block, swirling in lazy, hypnotic patterns. I stepped toward them, my pulse quickening, the hum growing louder with each step, and then they disappeared. It was instantaneous, like flipping a switch. The street plunged back into darkness, and the only sound was the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. I stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where the lights had been. The next morning, I noticed the footprints. They weren't mine. They started at the edge of my yard, leading up to my front door in a single, unbroken trail. The prints were small, child-sized, but the edges were sharp, too precise. It was as if they'd been pressed into the dirt with a stamp, not by something living. There were no other tracks, nothing leading away. I checked the lock on my door. It was still secure. That night, the lights didn't come back, but the hum did. I woke around 3 a.m., the sound vibrating through my pillow. It was deeper now, resonating in my bones, and I realized with a jolt that it wasn't coming from outside. It was inside the house. I grabbed the flashlight from the couch and crept toward the sound, every muscle in my body tensed. The hum led me to the kitchen. The window above the sink was open, the curtains fluttering gently in the breeze. I hadn't opened it. I knew I hadn't. My hands shook as I shut it, locking the latch. The hum stopped. In the silence that followed, I heard something else, a faint, rhythmic tapping, coming from the living room. I turned slowly, the flashlight trembling in my grip. The lights were back. They pulsed faintly, spilling through the living room window, casting the furniture in shifting hues of green and blue. And standing in the center of the room was a figure. It was small, no taller than a child, but its proportions were wrong. Too thin, too elongated. The light made it hard to see clearly, but its head seemed misshapen, tilted at an unnatural angle. It didn't move. Neither did I. For a long moment, we stood there, the hum building again, louder, more insistent. The figure tilted its head further, as if studying me, and then it stepped forward. I dropped the flashlight. When I woke, it was morning. The living room was empty. The window was shut. The lights were gone. But the hum was still there, faint and steady, like a heartbeat just beneath the surface. I checked the yard. The footprints were back, more of them this time, circling the house in a chaotic, looping pattern. They led nowhere. That night, I locked every door and window. I left every light in the house on, every TV and radio playing, trying to drown out the silence. It didn't help. The lights didn't wait outside this time. I woke to find them inside, spilling across the walls like liquid, pooling on the floor in shimmering puddles. The hum was deafening now, a constant, throbbing presence that made it hard to think. The figure was back, standing at the foot of my bed. It was closer now. I could see its face, or what should have been its face. The surface was smooth and featureless, reflecting the shifting colors of the lights. It reached out, its hand impossibly long, its fingers tapering into sharp points. And then it spoke, not in words, but in sound. The hum shifted, becoming something sharper, more deliberate, each note cutting through me like a blade. I didn't understand the message, but I felt it. It wasn't a warning. It was an invitation. The next morning, the lights were gone. The hum was gone. The footprints were gone. But I can't shake the feeling that something is waiting, just out of sight. Sometimes, in the quiet moments between thoughts, I catch myself humming a tune I don't remember learning. And at night, when the world is still, I see faint glimmers in the corners of my vision. I think they're coming back, and this time, they won't leave without me. On my 32nd birthday, the clock in my kitchen began counting backward. It was one of those cheap wall clocks, plastic and uninspired, with a dull tick that blended into the white noise of the apartment. I hadn't noticed it in weeks, maybe months, but as I poured my morning coffee, the motion caught my eye. The second hand jerked downward, not upward. Tick by tick, it marched in reverse, dragging the minute hand with it. At first, I thought it was broken. I took it off the wall, pulled the batteries, and popped in fresh ones. It resumed its peculiar rhythm immediately, counting seconds in reverse, a clock determined to rewind. I laughed it off as a quirk, an odd coincidence on the day I officially felt older. But as the day unfolded, small things began to unravel. The neighbor's dog barked incessantly at my door, though I'd never heard it bark before. My phone's calendar glitched, its events shifting into the past. By noon, even the light outside my window seemed different, softer, tinged with the golden haze of a memory. At 3:47 p.m., my sister called. Her voice was frantic, the words tumbling over themselves. "Have you noticed anything strange?" I hesitated. "You mean besides my clock losing its mind?" "Your clock?" "It's counting backward," I said. "Started this morning." She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was soft, careful. That's not supposed to happen yet." "Yet?" She exhaled sharply, a sound caught between frustration and fear. "Do you still have the box I gave you?" I had to think for a moment before I remembered it. My sister had handed me a small wooden box on my 21st birthday, wrapped in plain brown paper with a single instruction: "Don't open it until you have to." The box had lived at the back of my closet ever since, untouched and half forgotten. "Yeah, I still have it," I said. "Get it," she said, "and don't call me back until you do." The line went dead before I could ask her what she meant. The box was lighter than I remembered, its smooth surface unmarked by age or wear. It didn't have a lock or hinges, just a lid that slid open with ease. Inside was a watch. Its face was blank, no numbers or markings, and its single hand was frozen at the very top. The band was worn leather, soft to the touch, and as I held it in my hands, the air around me seemed to shift. It wasn't a dramatic change, nothing as overt as the walls shaking or the lights flickering. But the apartment felt different, as though it were holding its breath, waiting. The second I buckled the watch onto my wrist, it began to move. The hand swept slowly, deliberately, clockwise across the blank face. The room grew quieter, the hum of the refrigerator fading into nothingness. And then the doorbell rang. It wasn't a chime. It was a single, low note, reverberating through the walls. When I opened the door, the hallway was empty. No footsteps echoed down the corridor. No neighbors peeked from their doorways. Only a single envelope lay on the floor, plain and unmarked. Inside was a slip of paper, its edges yellowed and its ink faded. 2 words were scrawled across it in shaky handwriting. "Go back?" "Go back where?" The watch on my wrist clicked once, its hand jerking forward like a clock striking the hour. The room seemed to blur at the edges, the walls bleeding into one another. And when the world sharpened again, I wasn't in my apartment anymore. I was in the house where I'd grown up. The air was warm, the faint smell of fresh bread wafting from the kitchen. Sunlight poured through the windows, pooling on the scuffed wooden floor. And I heard my mother's voice. "Don't forget your lunch, sweetheart," she called from the kitchen, her tone light and cheerful. I froze. She'd been gone for years, lost to a stroke when I was 21. But here she was, alive and vibrant, bustling around the kitchen like no time had passed at all. My hand instinctively reached for the watch, but the leather band wouldn't budge. The kitchen door swung open, and she smiled at me, the lines around her eyes crinkling in a way I hadn't seen in over a decade. "Well, don't just stand there. You're going to miss the bus." "The bus?" I turned toward the mirror in the hallway and nearly dropped the watch. I was a child again. The face in the mirror wasn't mine. It was a younger version of me, maybe 10 years old, my hair messy and my backpack slung over one shoulder. "Go on now," my mother urged, handing me a brown paper bag. "You don't want to be late." "Late for what?" The watch clicked again, its hand moving forward another notch. The world shifted, dissolving into light and shadow, and I found myself in another moment. My first apartment, the thrill of independence still fresh in the air. The transitions came faster now, each scene blurring into the next. College, my first kiss, my father's funeral, a fight with my sister. Each memory unspooled before me, vivid and unrelenting. And then I was back in my apartment, gasping for breath, the watch's hand frozen at the top of its blank face. My phone buzzed on the counter. It was my sister. "Did you open it?" she asked, her voice tight. "Yes." "And you wore it?" "Yes," I said, my voice trembling. "What the hell just happened?" "You're lucky," she said. "It let you come back." "What is it?" There was a long pause, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. "It's not a watch," she said. "It's a choice." It began with the sound of breathing. Not mine, not anyone else's, just breathing. Slow, measured, and unmistakably close. I first noticed it one night while I was reading, stretched out on the worn couch in my living room. The house was quiet, the kind of silence you can only get living alone. But then there was the breathing. I thought it was coming from outside, maybe through an open window. I checked each one, making a circuit of the house. Locked. Every one of them. Yet the sound persisted, soft but steady, a rhythmic inhale and exhale that seemed to follow me as I moved. When I stopped in the hallway, the sound stopped too. I stood there, gripping the edge of the wall, waiting for it to return. My heart thudded painfully in the stillness, the silence pressing in on me like a physical weight. Then it was behind me. The breathing came from just over my shoulder, so close that the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I spun around, my hand instinctively rising to protect myself, but the hallway was empty. The sound stopped again. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I convinced myself it was nothing. Exhaustion, maybe, or some auditory trick of the house. I went to work, kept myself busy, tried to forget about it. By the time I returned home, I had almost convinced myself it had been a one-time thing. But when I opened the front door, I knew something was wrong. The air inside was heavy, stale, as though the house had been sealed for years. My stomach twisted, but I stepped inside anyway, flipping on the light. The bulb flickered once before steadying, casting a dim glow over the living room. Everything looked normal, but it didn't feel normal. I walked into the kitchen to drop my bag on the counter, and that's when I noticed it. A glass of water sat in the center of the table. I hadn't left it there. The water was cloudy, tiny bubbles clinging to the sides of the glass, as though it had just been poured. I stared at it for a long moment, trying to piece together an explanation. Maybe I had poured it earlier and forgotten. Maybe I was imagining things. The breathing started again. This time, it wasn't behind me. It was coming from the glass. I backed away, nearly tripping over one of the kitchen chairs, and grabbed my phone. My hands trembled as I dialed a friend, desperate for someone to talk to tell me I wasn't losing my mind. The call went through, but no one answered. Instead, the breathing came through the receiver, louder now, harsher, like it was pressing directly into my ear. I dropped the phone, the sound cutting off abruptly as it hit the floor. When I picked it up, the screen was blank. I left the house. That night, I stayed at a cheap motel on the edge of town, leaving the lights on and the television blaring as I tried to convince myself I was safe. But even there, I couldn't escape it. In the middle of the night, I woke to the sound of breathing again, louder and closer than ever. It wasn't just in the room. It was in me. I felt it rattling in my chest, forcing my lungs to move against my will. My own breathing had synced with it, every inhale and exhale controlled by something else. I ran to the bathroom, gripping the edges of the sink, staring into the mirror. My reflection stared back, pale and wide-eyed, my chest rising and falling with that unnatural rhythm. Then it smiled. Not me, it. My reflection's lips curled upward, slow and deliberate, even as my own face remained frozen in horror. "You let me in," it said, though my mouth never moved. The voice was mine but distorted, layered with something deeper, something ancient and inhuman. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The smile widened. "You were curious." The lights flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw something behind my reflection. A shadow, tall and angular, its shape impossible to define. When the light steadied, the shadow was gone. But my reflection wasn't. It leaned closer, pressing its hands against the glass, its smile fading into something more sinister. "You don't get to leave," it said. "Not anymore." The mirror cracked. The sound snapped me out of my trance, and I stumbled back, the bathroom door slamming shut behind me. When I looked around, the motel room was gone. I was standing in my house again. The glass of water was back on the table, untouched but no longer cloudy. The breathing was everywhere now, filling the air, vibrating in my bones. The mirror in the hallway caught my eye, and I turned toward it slowly, dreading what I might see. The reflection wasn't mine anymore. It was watching, and it wasn't breathing alone. I found the notebook on a park bench, tucked under a pile of damp leaves. It wasn't the kind of thing I'd usually pick up. God knows what people leave behind. But there was something about it that caught my attention. Its leather cover was old and cracked, the edges curling as though it had been through countless hands, and yet it didn't look discarded. It looked like it was waiting for someone. For me. I glanced around, expecting someone to come back for it, but the park was nearly empty. Just a few joggers and a dog chasing a stick. I stood there for a while, debating, before curiosity won. I slipped the notebook into my bag and took it home. That night, I sat at my desk, the notebook unopened in front of me. I don't know why I hesitated. Maybe it felt too personal, like reading a stranger's diary, but the moment I touched the cover again, a chill ran up my spine. It wasn't cold, exactly, but there was an odd weight to it, like I was holding more than just paper and ink. I opened it to the first page. The handwriting was neat and precise, written in a deep blue ink that seemed too bold for how faded the cover was. Rules. The first page read, underlined twice. Beneath it was a list, each rule numbered and followed by a brief explanation. 1. Do not skip pages. Read in order. 2. Never read aloud. 3. Stop reading if you hear footsteps. The rest of the page was blank. I stared at the rules, confused, but also intrigued. There was no name, no address, no indication of who the notebook belonged to or why it existed. Just those instructions, cryptic and unsettling. Against my better judgment, I flipped to the next page. It wasn't a diary, at least not in the traditional sense. Each page contained a short entry, like a vignette or a memory, but they weren't connected. The first one described a man walking through a forest at dusk. He was alone, but he kept glancing over his shoulder, sensing movement in the trees. The writing was vivid, almost too vivid, and I could hear the crunch of leaves under his boots, the rustling of branches above him. As I read, I felt like I was there, watching him. Then, without warning, the man stopped and turned, his face pale with fear. The entry ended mid-sentence, as though someone had ripped away the rest of the story. The next few entries were similar, scenes that seemed to lead somewhere but never did. A woman sitting in an empty theater, the seats around her coated in dust. A child staring at a boarded-up house, her reflection distorted in a cracked window. A man in a suit walking down an endless hallway lined with mirrors. Each one was unnervingly detailed, and each one ended abruptly. I couldn't stop reading. By the fifth entry, something had changed. The handwriting was different, messier, like the writer's hand had started trembling. The scene described a room I recognized, a diner I used to visit with my parents when I was a kid. It hadn't been open for years, but the description was exact, down to the torn vinyl seats and the flickering neon sign outside. The entry ended with a question. How long has it been since you were here? My hands shook as I turned the page. The next scene was worse. It was my old bedroom, the one from the house we moved out of when I was 13. I could picture it perfectly. The faded posters on the walls, the scuff marks on the floor where I used to drag my chair, even the crack in the ceiling I used to stare at when I couldn't sleep. The entry described the room in detail, but it didn't stop there. It described me, sitting on the bed, staring at the door. The last line read, "You remember what happens next, don't you?" I slammed the notebook shut and pushed it away, my chest tight. I hadn't thought about that house in years, hadn't wanted to, but now the memories flooded back, sharp and unwelcome. The night I woke to the sound of someone walking down the hall, slow and deliberate. The way the floorboards creaked outside my door, stopping just before the handle turned. I'd always told myself it was a dream, but reading it now, it felt real. Too real. I should have thrown the notebook away. I should have burned it, buried it, anything to get rid of it. But instead, I sat there, staring at it, drawn to it like a moth to a flame. I don't know how long I stayed like that, but eventually, I opened it again. The next entry was blank. The page after that, too. I flipped through, searching for the next scene, but the rest of the notebook was empty. I don't know why, but this filled me with a strange sense of dread. It was as if the notebook had been abandoned mid-thought, its purpose incomplete. I closed it again, vowing not to read any further. But that night, as I lay in bed, I dreamed of footsteps. They were faint at first, distant, but they grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside my door. When I woke, my heart pounding, I swore I could still hear them echoing in my ears. The next morning, the notebook was open on my desk, though I was certain I'd closed it. A new entry had appeared on the blank page. It described me, sitting at my desk, reading the notebook. The final line chilled me to the core. You're not alone. I didn't go to work that day. I didn't leave the apartment. I spent the day trying to figure out what was happening, but no matter how much I rationalized it, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I checked the locks on my doors and windows, but they were secure. The notebook stayed on the desk, untouched, though I could feel it waiting. That night, I heard the footsteps again, louder this time. They didn't stop outside my door. They continued into my apartment, moving through the kitchen, the living room, closer and closer. I grabbed the notebook, desperate for answers, and flipped to the next blank page. The words appeared as I watched, written in that same trembling hand. You let it in. I dropped the notebook and ran. I don't know how long I drove, but I didn't stop until I was miles away, parked on the side of an empty road. The notebook was still in the passenger seat. I didn't remember grabbing it, but there it was, waiting. I've tried to get rid of it. I've thrown it into rivers, left it in dumpsters, burned it until the pages turned to ash. But every morning, it's there, waiting on my desk, open to the next blank page. I don't know how to escape it. I don't even know if I want to. Sometimes, I hear the footsteps again, and I wonder if they're coming for me, or if they're already here. I was staying at the cabin to escape. The plan was simple. 2 weeks in the middle of nowhere, no Wi-Fi, no phone, just the woods and a stack of unread books. It had been my uncle's place, long abandoned after he passed, and the family kept it more out of nostalgia than practicality. The roof needed work, the floor creaked, and the wallpaper was peeling in long, curled strips. It was perfect. The first few days were uneventful. Mornings spent hiking the trails, afternoons with a book on the porch, evenings by the fire. The kind of quiet that makes you feel like you've stepped out of time. But by the third night, I noticed something strange. The wind didn't sound right. It wasn't just the typical rustling of leaves or the occasional creak of the cabin settling. It was heavier, more rhythmic, as though it carried something deliberate. I told myself it was just my imagination, city nerves adjusting to the stillness. When I went to bed that night, I dreamed of the woods. In the dream, the trees pressed closer together, their branches twisting overhead to blot out the sky. The air was thick and damp, and there was a sound in the distance, faint but distinct. A whistle, low and haunting, the kind of tune you hum without knowing where you learned it. When I woke, the sound was still in my ears. The next day, the forest felt different. The trails I'd walked before seemed unfamiliar, the trees leaning in ways they hadn't before. I chalked it up to poor sleep and kept moving, but the feeling of being watched clung to me like a second skin. I found the first marker that afternoon. It was a crude thing, carved into the trunk of a birch tree. A spiral, its lines deep and uneven. There was something about it that felt wrong, though I couldn't put my finger on why. I looked around, but the woods were empty, silent except for the faint rustling of leaves. That night, the whistle returned. It started faint, barely audible over the crackle of the fire. A single, low note, held for too long, as though whoever, or whatever, was making it wasn't bound by the need to breathe. I stepped onto the porch, my flashlight cutting thin beams through the trees. The sound stopped. I stood there for a long time, the flashlight trembling in my hand, but the forest gave nothing back, just the stillness of the night and the faint glow of the moon through the branches. When I woke the next morning, the spiral was carved into the cabin door. The lines were identical to the one I'd seen on the birch tree, the wood rough and splintered as though the carving had been done in haste. I grabbed the flashlight and followed the trail back to the tree. The marker was gone. The spiral had disappeared completely, the bark smooth and untouched. I walked deeper into the woods, my pulse quickening with every step. The forest seemed darker now, the air colder, the silence heavier. That's when I saw them. Markers. Dozens of them, carved into trees, rocks, even the ground itself. Spirals, concentric circles, overlapping lines that seemed to hum with some unseen energy. At the center of it all was a clearing. The grass was flattened, the soil disturbed, as though something heavy had passed through. In the middle of the clearing stood a single object, a wooden pole, its surface covered in carvings. Spirals again, but deeper this time. Their edges stained dark, as though with sap or something else. The air was wrong there, thick and electric, pressing against my skin. And then the whistle returned. I don't remember running back to the cabin, but when I got there, the door was open. Inside, the fire was out, the air damp and cold. The spirals were everywhere now, etched into the walls, the furniture, the windows. My breath caught as I realized they weren't just carvings. They were moving. The lines shifted, curling and uncurling like living things, their shapes hypnotic, drawing my gaze deeper and deeper until the whistle snapped me out of it. It was louder now, closer, and I slammed the door shut, shoving a chair against it for good measure. I didn't sleep. The whistle continued throughout the night, rising and falling in a way that felt deliberate, like it was waiting for me to understand. By morning, the spirals were gone. The walls, the furniture, the windows, all clean, as though they'd never been marked. But the whistle stayed with me. Even now, back in the city, I can hear it. Soft and distant, always just at the edge of hearing. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see the spirals, and they're moving. The house on Linton Street wasn't abandoned. At least, that's what I told myself every time I walked by. It had no boarded-up windows, no sagging roof, no overgrown lawn. In fact, it looked immaculate. Fresh white paint, dark shutters, and a vibrant red door. Yet, no one ever went in or out. No lights came on at night, and no mail ever sat in the black iron mailbox. I passed it every morning on my way to work, and every morning, I felt the same prickle of unease. Something about the house felt expectant, like it was waiting. I kept my eyes forward and quickened my pace whenever I neared it, telling myself it was just a house, no different from any other. That changed the day I saw the curtain move. It was a gray Tuesday morning, rain drizzling softly as I walked past. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. The lace curtain in the front window twitching, as though someone had been watching me and ducked out of sight. I stopped mid-step, my pulse quickening as I stared at the window. The curtain hung perfectly still now, and the glass reflected nothing but the overcast sky. I wanted to believe I'd imagined it, but a part of me knew I hadn't. There had been movement, deliberate and human, in a house that was supposed to be empty. By the time I got to work, I'd almost convinced myself it wasn't worth worrying about. Maybe a stray draft had caught the fabric, or maybe I was projecting my unease onto the house itself. But that night, on my way home, I saw something else. The light above the red door was on. I stopped at the end of the street, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't a bright light, just a soft yellow glow spilling onto the porch, but it was enough to make the house feel alive. The light hadn't been there that morning. I was certain of it. The rest of the street was dark and quiet, the kind of suburban silence that feels oppressive rather than peaceful. I took a cautious step forward, my shoes crunching on the wet gravel. The closer I got, the heavier the air seemed to grow, pressing against my skin like static before a storm. When I reached the house, I stood frozen on the sidewalk, staring at the door. The light flickered once, then went out. I hurried home without looking back, my chest tight with a fear I couldn't explain. The next day, the house seemed normal again. No light, no movement, no signs of life. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was aware of me now, like the curtain twitch and the light were invitations I hadn't yet acknowledged. By Friday, I couldn't stand it anymore. Curiosity gnawed at me like a splinter buried too deep to dig out. I left work early and walked straight to the house, my heart pounding with every step. The closer I got, the more wrong it felt. The air was thick, humming faintly, as if the house itself were breathing. When I reached the porch, I hesitated. The red door loomed before me, its glossy surface unblemished by time or weather. There was no doorbell, just an old brass knocker shaped like a lion's head. I reached for it, my hand trembling, but before I could touch it, the door swung open. The hallway beyond was dim, lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. The walls were bare, the floor polished wood that gleamed faintly in the light. A faint smell of lavender and something metallic wafted out, and my stomach churned. "Hello?" My voice sounded small, swallowed by the stillness of the house. No response. I stepped inside, the door clicking shut behind me. The sound echoed down the hallway, louder than it should have been. The air felt colder now, the faint hum from outside replaced by a deeper, almost imperceptible vibration. The hallway stretched longer than it should have. I walked slowly, my footsteps muffled by the strange weight of the air. Doors lined the walls, all identical and unmarked, their handles polished to a mirror-like shine. None of them were open. At the end of the hall was a staircase, its steps carpeted in deep red. It spiraled upward, disappearing into shadows. A faint sound drifted down from above, soft and rhythmic, like footsteps just beyond the edge of hearing. I didn't want to go up, but my feet moved on their own, the pull of the house stronger than my fear. Each step creaked softly beneath my weight, the sound blending with the distant footsteps. By the time I reached the top, my legs felt heavy, and my breath came in shallow gasps. The second floor was darker, the walls closer, the air colder. A single door stood at the far end, its surface painted the same vivid red as the front door. The footsteps had stopped now, leaving only the faint vibration that seemed to come from within the walls. I approached the door slowly, my hands clenched into fists. When I reached it, I hesitated, my reflection distorted in the glossy surface. Then, before I could lose my nerve, I pushed it open. The room beyond was empty, save for a single chair sitting in the center. It was wooden, old and worn, with a high back and spindled legs. A mirror hung on the far wall, its frame cracked and tarnished, the glass rippling faintly like water. I stepped inside, and the door shut behind me with a finality that made my chest tighten. I turned to leave, but the door wouldn't budge. The vibrations in the air grew louder, stronger, shaking the floor beneath me. When I turned back to the room, the chair was no longer empty. A figure sat there, its back to me, its head bowed as if in thought. Its body was draped in shadows, its outline shifting like smoke. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The mirror reflected the figure too, but in the glass, it was standing, facing me. It raised its head in the mirror, though the figure in the chair remained still. Its face was blank, featureless, yet its gaze bore into me, heavy and unrelenting. "Why did you come?" The voice wasn't human. It was deep and hollow, vibrating through my bones. I couldn't answer. My throat was dry, my words trapped somewhere between my chest and my mind. The figure in the mirror stepped closer, its movements fluid but wrong. The closer it got, the darker the room became, the shadows creeping up the walls like living things. The last thing I saw was its hand reaching for the glass, the surface rippling as it broke through. I woke on the sidewalk outside, the house silent and dark. The red door was closed, the windows blank. My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone, desperate for something familiar, something real. But when I turned on the screen, the reflection of my face stared back from the black background. Behind me, just over my shoulder, was the figure. The postcards began arriving on the first day of spring. They were old-fashioned, the kind you'd expect to find in an antique shop. Faded ink depicted pastoral scenes, rolling hills, quiet villages, and bridges arched over rivers. There was no return address, no sender's name, just a single line of text on the back. The first postcard read, "The door is open." It was strange, but not unsettling. I assumed it was a misdelivery or a prank and tucked it into a drawer, forgetting about it until the second one arrived 2 days later. This one was darker. The image was a dense forest, its trees twisted unnaturally, their branches clawing at a gray sky. The text on the back read, "You left it that way." I stared at it for a long time, turning it over in my hands. But the more I looked, the more the trees seemed to shift. At one point, I thought I saw a figure between the branches, standing far off and blurred, but when I blinked, it was gone. By the time the third postcard arrived, the unease had taken root. It showed a house, small and nondescript, but the longer I looked, the more familiar it became. It was my house. The text read, "They are already inside." My pulse quickened as I checked every lock, every window, every corner of my home. Nothing was out of place, but the postcard felt like a warning. The next morning, I found the fourth postcard on my bedside table. I hadn't heard anyone come in during the night. The doors were still locked, and there was no sign of forced entry. The image this time was a staircase spiraling down into blackness. "Follow them," it said. I didn't know what that meant, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. But the postcards kept coming. They arrived daily, each one more vivid than the last. An empty room, its floorboards warped and rotting. A hallway lit by a single, flickering bulb. A narrow alleyway, its walls streaked with something dark and wet. And the messages grew stranger. "Listen closely. The knocking is not from the door. Do not turn around." I stopped sleeping. I kept every light on in the house, hoping it would keep whatever was sending these messages at bay. But no matter how vigilant I was, the postcards always appeared. On the kitchen counter, the bathroom sink, once even tucked inside my coat pocket. The 10th postcard showed a face. It wasn't human. The features were there. Eyes, a mouth, the vague shape of a nose. But they were wrong, stretched and distorted, as though the face had been pressed against glass and pulled in different directions. The text read, "You've seen me before." I hadn't. At least, I didn't think I had. The 11th postcard showed me. It was a photograph, not a drawing. I was sitting in my living room, staring at something out of frame. My face was pale, my eyes hollow. I didn't remember sitting like that. I didn't remember the photo being taken. The message was short, "Look closer." I turned the postcard over, squinting at the edges of the photograph. There, in the shadows behind me, was the same figure I thought I'd seen in the forest. It was closer now, its blurred outline more defined. I threw the postcard in the trash and locked myself in my room. That night, I woke to the sound of knocking. It wasn't at the door. It was inside the house, coming from somewhere deep below. The 12th postcard was waiting for me when I opened my eyes. It wasn't on the nightstand or the floor. It was in my hand, though I didn't remember picking it up. The image was a door, tall and ancient, its wood cracked and blackened as though burned. "Open it," the message said. I didn't want to. I spent the day walking from room to room, searching for any sign of the door. I checked the basement, the attic, even the crawl space, but there was nothing. The knocking continued, louder now, more insistent. When the 13th postcard arrived, I didn't even open it. I burned it in the sink, watching the flames lick away at the edges until there was nothing left but ash. That night, the knocking stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. The 14th postcard didn't arrive the next morning, or the morning after that. For 3 days, I dared to hope that it was over. Then, on the 4th night, I woke to find the door. It stood in the middle of my living room, impossibly tall, its blackened surface matching the image from the postcard. I didn't open it. I sat on the floor, staring at it, the air around me thick and cold. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. It was impossible to tell. And then the door began to creak open. A thin sliver of darkness spilled out, deeper than anything I'd ever seen. It wasn't empty. Something moved within, its outline shifting and impossible, like smoke caught in a storm. I should have run. Instead, I stepped closer. When I crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me. I've been trying to send postcards ever since. When my sister Elise died, the house became mine. She had inherited it from our grandparents, a sprawling Victorian on the edge of town with a turret that loomed like a watchful eye. Elise had always loved it, filling it with mismatched furniture, the scent of cinnamon candles, and a warmth that made the place feel alive despite its age. I hadn't stepped inside the house for years, Not since she and I had a falling out over something trivial that seemed monumental at the time. But after her funeral, I stood on the threshold with the key in my hand, the house creaking softly in the wind. It felt heavier than it should. The first thing I noticed was that the house didn't smell like Elise anymore. The warmth she'd filled it with was gone. The air carried an almost imperceptible odor, faint and sharp, like rain on hot pavement. I told myself it was just the smell of a house left unoccupied for months. The second thing I noticed was the mirror in the foyer. I didn't remember it being there before. It was massive, framed in tarnished gold, its surface flawless despite the layers of dust on everything else. The mirror was hung opposite the front door, reflecting the entryway in perfect detail. When I moved closer, I saw something strange in the reflection. It wasn't me. Not entirely. The woman in the mirror was wearing my clothes, and her face was mine, but her expression was wrong. Subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniably different. Her eyes didn't widen with surprise, as mine had. Her lips twitched at the corners, not into a smile, but into something far colder. I stepped back, and the reflection stepped with me, perfectly in sync. It must have been my imagination. I shook off the unease and spent the afternoon exploring the house, reconnecting with the rooms I'd once known so well. Elise's things were still scattered everywhere. Books with notes scribbled in the margins, mugs with faded lipstick stains, a scarf she draped over the back of a chair and never moved. But there was something else too. Small changes I couldn't explain. A picture frame on the mantel, its photo swapped for a blank, black rectangle. A drawer in the kitchen filled not with utensils, but with broken pieces of glass. And always, the faint scent of rain on pavement. That night, I woke to the sound of footsteps. They were soft, deliberate, moving through the hall outside my bedroom. I froze, the blankets clutched in my hands, listening as the steps came closer. When they stopped just outside the door, I held my breath. The door didn't open. Instead, the steps moved again, retreating back down the hall and into silence. In the morning, I convinced myself it had been a dream, but the mirror had changed. This time, the woman wasn't in sync with me at all. She stood still while I leaned closer, her head tilting slightly as though studying me. Her eyes were darker than I remembered. Her lips curved in that same unsettling, almost smile. I moved a hand toward the glass, my fingers trembling, but stopped short when she moved first. Her hand pressed against the inside of the mirror, her palm flat against the surface. I stumbled back, the breath catching in my throat. Her smile widened. That night, the footsteps returned, louder now, echoing through the halls. The faint scent of rain on pavement grew stronger, filling the room, and when I opened my eyes, I saw it. The mirror had been moved. It was no longer in the foyer. It was in my bedroom, leaning against the wall, its surface gleaming in the moonlight. The woman stood on the other side, her head tilted again, her hand pressed against the glass. This time, her mouth moved, but no sound came through. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the mirror, dragged it down the stairs, and shoved it into the basement. The scent faded almost immediately, and for the first time in days, the house felt lighter. But that night, I heard her voice, faint, distant, and coming from beneath the floorboards. "Let me out." The whispers didn't stop. They grew louder each night, filling the house until I couldn't think, couldn't sleep. When I finally went to the basement, the mirror wasn't where I'd left it. It was upright in the center of the room, its surface reflecting nothing but darkness. I stepped closer, my heart pounding, and for a moment, the glass rippled. Then I saw her face again, closer now. Her hands pressed against the surface as though she were trying to push through. Her lips moved once more, forming the words I'd been hearing all along. "Let me out." This time, I reached for the glass. The moment my fingers touched it, the world went dark. When I woke up, I was staring at the ceiling of the basement. The mirror was gone. But when I went upstairs, I saw it in the foyer again, hanging exactly where it had been the first day I arrived. The woman wasn't in the reflection anymore. I was. But something about my face was wrong. I wasn't expecting the elevator to open onto the wrong floor. My office is on the 17th, and I've taken the same elevator up and down every day for the last 3 years. It's a slow, clunky thing, the kind of elevator that shudders before it moves and hums uncomfortably loud when it does. But that day, when the doors slid open with their usual reluctant grind, I wasn't looking at the familiar beige hallway with its slightly crooked exit sign. I was staring at a long, dark corridor I'd never seen before. It didn't look like part of the building. The walls were concrete, unpainted and damp, with faint streaks of rust running down from exposed pipes. A single flickering bulb hung from the ceiling just past the elevator, casting jagged shadows that stretched and shrank as it swayed. I stood frozen, my briefcase in hand, as the elevator chimed softly. Its polite, mechanical way of telling me to get out. 17, I muttered to myself, glancing at the glowing button panel. The number was lit, but this wasn't my floor. Something about the corridor felt alive, like the air was vibrating just beneath the threshold of hearing. My chest tightened, my instincts screaming at me to hit the closed door button and leave, but I couldn't stop staring. There was something far down the corridor, just beyond the reach of the flickering light. It moved. I slammed my hand against the button, and the doors slid shut, cutting off my view of the corridor just as the bulb flickered again. The elevator jolted slightly before continuing its ascent, and when the doors opened again, I was on 17, standing in the familiar hallway outside my office. I laughed nervously, brushing it off as a mechanical glitch or some kind of service access area I wasn't supposed to see, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. The next morning, curiosity got the better of me. On my way up to the office, I waited until I was alone in the elevator and hit the button for the 17th floor. As it ascended, I watched the numbers tick upward. 14, 15, 16. When the elevator shuddered to a stop, I braced myself. The doors slid open. The corridor was there again. The same damp concrete walls, the same flickering bulb, the same suffocating air. This time, though, I noticed something new. Faint marks on the floor, as if something heavy had been dragged through the dust. I stepped forward without thinking, the tips of my shoes crossing the threshold. The air was colder here, almost icy, and the smell was sharp and metallic, like rust and old water. I turned back to the elevator, half expecting it to shut behind me, but the doors stayed open, the interior glowing warmly. "Just a look," I muttered, my voice too loud in the stillness. I took another step, then another, the sound of my footsteps swallowed by the thick, oppressive silence. The corridor stretched farther than it should have, the dim light giving way to shadows that seemed to shift as I approached. There was something up ahead, a doorway. It was open just a crack, a faint sliver of light spilling out into the corridor. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. No answer. I glanced back at the elevator, its open doors still waiting for me. Then I looked forward again, at the door and the faint light beyond. Something about it felt wrong, but I couldn't stop myself. I moved closer, my footsteps slow and deliberate. When I reached the door, I hesitated. The air was colder here, the metallic tang sharper, and I could hear something faint, whispers, low and indistinct, like a conversation taking place just out of earshot. I pushed the door open. Inside was a room, small and cramped, with walls that seemed to pulse faintly as though they were breathing. The light came from an old lamp on a table in the center, its shade tilted to one side. Scattered around the room were objects, things that didn't belong. A pair of shoes, worn and scuffed. A child's backpack, faded and stained. A shattered mirror leaning against the far wall, its fractured surface reflecting the lamplight in jagged shards. And then I saw the photos. They were pinned to the walls, dozens of them, all in black and white. Each one was a snapshot of a person, their faces blurred or partially obscured, their bodies caught mid-motion as though taken without their knowledge. In the center of the table was a single photo in a frame. It was of me. I staggered backward, my breath catching in my throat. The whispers grew louder. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing wildly as I sprinted back down the corridor. The elevator was still there, its doors mercifully open. I dove inside, slamming my hand against the closed door button. Just before the doors slid shut, I saw something move in the shadows of the corridor. The elevator jerked into motion, rising smoothly. When the doors opened again, I was on 17. I didn't go to work that day. At home, I locked every door and window, my mind racing. The image of that photo burned in my thoughts, the frame sitting too neatly on that table. By the next morning, I'd almost convinced myself it was a nightmare, some strange trick of the mind brought on by stress or lack of sleep. But when I stepped into the elevator, the button for the 17th floor was already glowing, and when the doors opened, the corridor was waiting. It happened on an ordinary Wednesday evening, though I realized now there was nothing ordinary about it. I was cleaning out my closet, an overdue chore I'd finally decided to tackle. The air was stale with the scent of old clothes and forgotten boxes, and I was down to the last shelf when I found it, a small, wooden box that didn't belong to me. I paused, brushing off the layer of dust that coated its surface. It wasn't the kind of box you'd buy in a store. It looked handmade, its edges slightly uneven, the wood polished to a dull sheen. There were no markings, no hinges, just a lid that fit snugly over the base. I didn't remember seeing it before. Curiosity won over caution. I pried the lid off, expecting it to be empty or filled with old receipts, something mundane. But what I found inside wasn't mundane at all. It was a key. At least, I think it was a key. It was heavier than it looked, cold to the touch, with an intricate pattern carved into its surface. The design was unlike anything I'd seen before, spiraling lines and sharp angles that seemed to shift when I turned it in the light. Something about it felt important. I searched the box for a note, a clue, anything to explain where it had come from or what it opened. There was nothing, just the key and the faint smell of metal lingering on my fingers. That night, I left the box on the kitchen counter and went to bed, the key tucked away in the back of my mind like a forgotten question. But when I woke the next morning, the box was gone. At first, I thought I'd misplaced it, but I searched the entire apartment, and it was nowhere to be found. The counter was spotless, as though it had never been there. I felt a twinge of unease, but I told myself it didn't matter. I hadn't locked the door. Maybe someone had come in and taken it. A burglar with oddly specific tastes, I thought, forcing a laugh. It wasn't until I reached for my jacket that I felt it. The key was in my pocket. I stopped, staring at it as my pulse quickened. I didn't remember putting it there. I didn't remember touching it after I'd first found it. The key was warmer now, almost pulsing faintly in my palm. I told myself it was just a trick of my imagination, shoved it back in my pocket, and left for work. That was when the doors started appearing. The first one was at the office. It was in a hallway I'd walked down countless times, tucked into the farthest corner where there had never been a door before. It didn't belong there. The frame was old, the wood scratched and splintered, the handle worn smooth. The surface of the door was painted black, its color so dark it seemed to absorb the light around it. I froze, staring at it. The air in the hallway was colder now, sharper, carrying the faintest hum that made my teeth ache. "Hey," someone said behind me, making me jump. It was Ellie, one of my coworkers, her arms full of files. "You okay?" I glanced back at the door, ready to point it out, but it was gone. Ellie frowned. "What are you looking at?" "Nothing," I mumbled, my voice unsteady. The second door appeared 3 days later, in the stairwell of my apartment building. This one was red, with peeling paint and a rusted brass handle. It was tucked beneath the stairs, where there had only ever been a blank wall before. I reached for the handle without thinking, and my fingers brushed against the metal. It was cold, colder than it should have been. The door didn't budge, but the key in my pocket grew warmer, almost burning against my skin. I pulled it out slowly, holding it in front of me. The carvings on its surface seemed to shift again, the spirals twisting into new shapes, the angles bending in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The key felt alive. I didn't open the door. I couldn't. By the time I worked up the courage, it had disappeared, leaving behind only a faint outline of dust where it had been. The third door didn't give me a choice. It was in my apartment, standing in the middle of the living room like it had always been there. This one was different. The wood was polished and smooth, its surface unblemished, the handle gleaming as though it had just been polished. It was beautiful, and it was waiting. I didn't reach for the handle this time. The The key slipped from my hand on its own, falling to the floor and sliding toward the door as though pulled by an unseen force. The moment it touched the lock, the door clicked open. It didn't swing inward. It didn't creak or groan. It simply was. Beyond it, there was nothing. Not darkness, not light, just an expanse of absence. A void that felt alive, pulsing faintly like the beat of a distant heart. I stepped back, my breath catching in my throat. The door seemed to grow taller, its edges stretching toward the ceiling, the frame warping like it was breathing. And then something stepped through. It wasn't human. Not entirely. Its form was fluid, shifting, its edges blurring as though it were made of smoke and glass. But its eyes, or what I thought were its eyes, locked onto mine, and I felt a pull so deep it made my bones ache. "You found it," it said, though its voice wasn't a voice. It was a feeling, a resonance that vibrated through my chest. "I didn't mean to," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if it could hear me. "You're the key." The words didn't make sense, but the moment it spoke them, the air around me seemed to crackle, the walls bending inward. The thing stepped closer, its shape solidifying, and I stumbled back. "Wait," I said, though I didn't know what I was asking for. It smiled, or at least I think it did, and then everything went dark. When I woke, the door was gone. The key was still in my pocket, warm and pulsing like it had a heartbeat. I don't open doors anymore, but they keep finding me. When I moved into the new apartment, I found a locked door in the hallway that wasn't on the floor plan. It was between the bathroom and the bedroom, a narrow wooden door with peeling white paint and an old brass knob. At first, I thought it was a utility closet or maybe an access point for the maintenance team. I tried the knob out of curiosity, but it didn't budge. Locked tight. I called the landlord to ask about it, but his answer was casual, almost dismissive. "Oh, it's just sealed up. Probably used to be a closet or something. Don't worry about it." I did worry about it. The door didn't make sense. The layout of the apartment left no room for a closet or a passageway. I even knocked on the wall surrounding it, hoping to hear a hollow echo, but the sound was solid. It was as if the door led to nowhere, and yet, it felt too deliberate to ignore. I tried not to think about it during the first week. I focused on unpacking, settling in, and adjusting to my new space. But at night, when the apartment was silent, I couldn't help glancing at that door as I walked to the bedroom. And then one night, I heard the creak. It was faint, but unmistakable, the sound of wood shifting, as if the door had moved ever so slightly in its frame. I froze in the hallway, staring at it, waiting for something else to happen. The air felt heavier, pressing against my skin like an invisible weight, but the door stayed still. The next morning, I noticed the scratch. It was a thin line running vertically down the paint, fresh and clean against the peeling surface. It hadn't been there before. I ran my fingers over it, feeling the rough edge, but I had no explanation for how it had appeared. Over the next few days, more scratches appeared, forming a jagged, uneven pattern. They didn't seem random. They started low, near the base of the door, and worked their way upward, as if something on the other side were clawing its way out. I told myself it was nothing. Old wood, expanding and contracting with the changing temperature. Maybe the maintenance team had bumped it during repairs. Then I heard the knock. It came late at night, soft and deliberate. A single rap that echoed through the hallway. I was in bed, scrolling through my phone, when the sound froze me in place. Knock. I got up, heart pounding, and crept to the hallway. The door was as it had always been. Shut, locked, silent. I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting for the sound to come again. When it didn't, I went back to bed. The knocking grew louder over the following nights. One knock became 2, then 3, the sound more insistent each time. By the end of the week, it was a relentless, pounding rhythm that seemed to rattle the walls. I called the landlord again, trying to keep my voice steady. "That sealed door in the hallway, it's making noises." There was a long pause before he answered. "It's just the pipes," he said, his tone forced and hollow. "That's normal in a building this old." "No," I said, gripping the phone tighter. "It's not pipes. Someone, or something, is behind the door." Another pause, longer this time. "Don't try to open it," he said finally. Then he hung up. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, the scratches had formed a pattern, spirals and jagged lines that spread outward like a web. The wood around the frame was splintering now, as if the door were straining against its hinges. And there was something else. At the base of the door, just visible beneath the edge, was a thin line of shadow. Not a crack, not a gap in the floorboards, just pure, impenetrable blackness, as if the space beyond the door didn't exist. I should have left. I should have packed my things and walked out without looking back. But the door wouldn't let me go. That night, the knocking stopped. I should have felt relief, but the silence was worse. It pressed against me, heavy and suffocating, filling the apartment like a physical presence. Then the whispers began. They were faint at first, barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator. But as the hours stretched on, they grew louder, overlapping voices that came from nowhere and everywhere. They didn't speak in words I understood, but their intent was clear. They wanted me to open the door. I don't know how long I sat in the hallway, staring at the brass knob. My thoughts were jumbled, my body frozen in place. Every instinct screamed at me to stay away, but the whispers were relentless, burrowing into my mind like worms. At some point, I moved. My hand was on the knob before I even realized what I was doing. It turned easily this time, the lock clicking open with a sound that sent shivers down my spine. The door swung inward. The space beyond wasn't a room. It wasn't anything. It was an endless void, deeper and darker than any shadow I'd ever seen. The air was cold, sharp, pulling at me with invisible hands. And then I saw them. Figures emerged from the blackness, their forms shifting and indistinct. They moved like smoke, swirling and twisting, their eyes glowing faintly with a light that wasn't human. They didn't step forward. They poured out, spilling into the hallway like a flood. I stumbled back, but the pull was too strong. The void reached for me, the figures growing closer, their whispers deafening now. A single, overwhelming command. "Come through." I don't remember slamming the door shut, but I must have, because when I woke, I was lying on the hallway floor, the brass knob cold against my cheek. The door was locked again. The scratches were gone. The whispers stopped. For the first time in weeks, the apartment felt normal. Empty, quiet, but I can still feel it. The pull, the shadows behind the door, waiting. I found the envelope on my doorstep one crisp autumn morning, its corners damp with dew. It was unremarkable at first glance, plain, white, no return address, until I picked it up. My name was written on the front in ink that shimmered faintly in the sunlight, as though it had been written just moments before. No one else in the building had seen it arrive, and the thought of someone slipping up to my door unnoticed made me uneasy. Still, curiosity has a way of overriding caution. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded precisely. The handwriting was elegant, almost archaic, the kind you'd expect on an old invitation or a letter from another century. The message was short. "You are cordially invited to witness something extraordinary. Midnight. The East Meadow." The East Meadow was a stretch of abandoned land at the edge of town, a place everyone knew but no one visited. Overgrown and unremarkable, it had become the kind of space you forgot about until you passed it on your way somewhere else. The invitation didn't include a cinder, nor did it explain what this extraordinary event might be. It should have gone straight into the trash. Instead, I slipped it into my jacket pocket. All day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. At the grocery store, on the bus, even in my own apartment, there was a weight in the air, a tension that made the edges of the world feel sharper. Twice, I thought I caught movement in the corner of my vision, but when I turned, there was nothing there. By the time night fell, the invitation felt less like a curiosity and more like a summons. I told myself I wouldn't go, that it was probably a prank or worse. But as the clock crept closer to midnight, something in me shifted. I found myself putting on my coat and stepping into the cold, as if compelled by an unseen hand. The walk to the East Meadow was longer than I remembered, the streets eerily quiet. Even the usual hum of distant traffic seemed to have vanished, leaving only the sound of my own footsteps on the cracked pavement. The closer I got, the heavier the air became. like the world was holding its breath. When I reached the meadow, I stopped. The grass was tall and silver in the moonlight, the trees at the edge casting long, skeletal shadows. In the center of the field stood a group of people, their figures silhouetted against the glow of a strange, flickering light. I hesitated at the edge of the meadow, my instincts screaming at me to turn back. But before I could move, one of the figures turned toward me and beckoned. Their arm moved slowly, deliberately, as if they had been waiting for me all along. I stepped forward. The group stood in a loose circle around a strange object, a box, black and featureless, pulsing faintly with a light that didn't seem to come from any visible source. The air around it shimmered, distorting the figures like a heat mirage. They didn't speak, but I could feel their eyes on me as I approached. "Step forward," one of them said. Their voice was soft but carried an undeniable weight, as though the words themselves were heavier than air. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "An opportunity," another answered, "to see beyond." Before I could respond, they parted, creating a path to the box. The light it emitted was hypnotic, pulling at something deep within me. I stepped closer, unable to resist. The box was smooth and cold to the touch, its surface absorbing the moonlight rather than reflecting it. I knelt beside it, my hand hovering over the lid. The others watched silently, their faces unreadable. "What happens if I open it?" I asked. "That depends," the first figure said, "on whether you're ready." "For what?" "To know." The word struck me like a physical blow, and for a moment, I considered leaving. But something deeper, a need I couldn't name, kept me rooted in place. Slowly, I lifted the lid. The light flared, blinding and all-consuming. For a moment, I saw everything. Infinite possibilities, layered realities folding into one another like paper cranes. I saw myself in countless forms, young, old, thriving, broken, and understood that all of them were true, existing simultaneously. The scope of it was unbearable, and my mind reeled, struggling to comprehend. And then, as quickly as it began, the light vanished. I was back in the meadow, the box now closed and inert. The group around me began to fade, their forms dissolving into the night like smoke. Only one remained, their face hidden beneath a hood. "What was that?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "The truth," they said. "A fragment of it." "I don't understand." "You will," they replied. "But understanding comes with a cost." I blinked, and they were gone. I stumbled home, my thoughts a tangled mess. The city was as silent as before, the streets empty and still. When I reached my apartment, I found the invitation on my kitchen table, though I was certain I'd left it in my jacket. The next morning, I tried to return to normal life. I went to work, shopped for groceries, called my mother. But the world didn't feel the same. Colors were sharper, sounds louder, as if reality itself had been cranked up to an unbearable intensity. Worse, I started seeing things. Flickers of movement, shapes that didn't belong. Shadows stretched in impossible directions, and reflections lingered too long in mirrors. By the end of the week, I realized I wasn't alone. At first, it was just a sense, an awareness of something just out of sight. Then I began to see it, a figure, tall and indistinct, watching from corners, from doorways, from places it shouldn't be. No one else noticed it, no matter how much I tried to point it out. The figure never moved, never spoke. It just watched, its presence a constant reminder of the box, of the light, of the truth I'd glimpsed and couldn't unsee. I stopped sleeping, stopped leaving the apartment. The figure was always there, always waiting. One night, as I sat in the dark, the invitation reappeared. It was different this time. The ink smeared as though it had been written in a rush. Return to the meadow. Midnight. Final choice. I don't know what I'll find when I go back, but I do know one thing. The figure isn't just watching anymore. It's closer now, and it's waiting for me to decide. The rain had been relentless all week, drowning the town in a ceaseless gray. By the fifth day, the basement of the bookstore I managed began to flood. I had been meaning to check the drainage system for months, but life kept getting in the way, as it always does. I waded down the creaky steps, the smell of damp paper and mildew already thick in the air. The water wasn't deep, just enough to lap at the tops of my boots, but it was spreading fast. Old cardboard boxes, bloated with water, floated lazily against the edges of the room. The main drain was clogged. A tangle of leaves and dirt sat at the edge of the metal grate, and I crouched down with a flashlight, ready to clear it out. As I worked, I noticed something odd. Beneath the water, the grate wasn't draining into the pipes as I'd expected. It was empty beneath. A void. I leaned closer, aiming the beam of light directly into the darkness. It wasn't just a hole. It was deep, deeper than it should have been. The building plans I'd seen showed no such space below the basement. But there it was, a black abyss, so dark the light seemed to vanish the moment it hit the edge. And then I heard it. A sound, faint but distinct. A whisper. It wasn't words, not exactly, more like the shape of them. A suggestion carried on a breeze that shouldn't have existed down there. I backed away, my heart pounding, the flashlight trembling in my hand. "Hello?" I called out, though the rational part of my brain already knew it wasn't a person. The whispering stopped. The water around the grate rippled, though I hadn't moved. I watched, frozen, as the ripples grew stronger, forming small waves that lapped against my boots. And then the drain opened wider. Not like a normal opening. It stretched. The metal of the grate groaned and warped, pulling apart like melted wax, and the void beneath it expanded. A gush of cold air rushed out, carrying that whispering sound, louder now, insistent. And then I saw it. Hands. They weren't human, not quite. Long, thin fingers tipped with pale, translucent nails emerged from the dark, gripping the edge of the widening hole. They moved with a strange fluidity, too fast and too slow at the same time. I scrambled backward, my foot catching on a stray box. The water splashed as I hit the ground, soaking through my jeans. The hands pulled up something else. It wasn't a person. It was a shape, vaguely human, but taller, its limbs elongated and wrong, its surface slick and reflective like wet stone. It unfolded itself, rising impossibly tall in the small space, its head nearly brushing the ceiling. It turned to look at me, though it had no eyes, no face, just a smooth, featureless plane where its features should have been. But I felt its gaze. The whispers stopped, replaced by a low hum that vibrated through the water and up into my chest. It wasn't random. It was a pattern, a deliberate rhythm that seemed to burrow into my skull. I scrambled to my feet and bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me. My heart pounded as I shoved the heavy metal filing cabinet in front of it, my breaths coming in shallow gasps. I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting, listening. The hum faded, but something else took its place. A knock. 3 slow, deliberate knocks against the door. I stared, my hand frozen on the edge of the filing cabinet. Another knock, louder this time. And then I heard the whisper again, clearer now, just on the other side of the door. My name. It knew my name. I backed away, my legs trembling, and grabbed the nearest thing I could find. A mop, as if that would do anything. The door rattled, but the cabinet held. For now, I ran outside, ignoring the rain that pelted my face as I fumbled with my keys to lock the building. As I slid into my car and started the engine, I glanced back at the storefront. The light in the basement window flickered. And then, for just a moment, I saw it, pressed against the glass, its featureless head tilted toward me. I drove. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of town. The bookstore remains locked. I've told no one, but every night, I hear it. A faint hum, a whisper on the wind, growing louder, and I know it's waiting. There was something off about the house the moment I stepped inside. It wasn't a haunted house kind of feeling. No creaky floors or cobwebs hanging in the corners. It was cleaner than I expected, almost sterile, the air too still and faintly cool. The light through the windows seemed muted, like the sun outside couldn't quite reach this place. I hadn't come here on purpose. I'd been driving back from my cousin's place, taking a detour to avoid the construction that had turned the main road into chaos. My GPS stopped working halfway through, leaving me to navigate by instinct. That's how I ended up on the dirt road, its edges overgrown with weeds, leading to a house I didn't recognize. I parked in the shade of a tall, gnarled oak tree and got out to stretch my legs. My plan was to turn around and head back the way I'd come, but the house caught my attention. It didn't belong here. The architecture was old, maybe Victorian, but it looked untouched, like it had been built yesterday and left for no one to live in. The windows were clean, the white paint fresh, the brass doorknob gleaming faintly in the late afternoon light. The front door was open, just a crack. I should have gotten back in the car. Instead, I walked to the porch. There was no creak of wood beneath my feet, no smell of mildew or dampness. The porch was perfect, like the rest of the house. My hand hesitated on the doorknob, the brass warm against my skin. When I pushed it open, the air inside seemed to breathe against me, faint and cool. "Hello?" I called, half hoping no one would answer. Silence. The foyer stretched out before me, its hardwood floors polished to a mirror-like sheen. To my left, a staircase curved upward, its banister gleaming in the dim light. To my right, a sitting room with a grand piano and a set of chairs arranged in a perfect semicircle, their upholstery pristine. There were no signs of life, no clutter, no dust, no sound, but something was here. I walked further in, the sound of my footsteps muffled by the strange, heavy air. Every room I passed was immaculate, a dining room with a long, polished table set with silverware that gleamed unnaturally, a library lined with books whose spines bore no titles, a kitchen where the counters were bare but spotless. Each space felt deliberate, like a stage waiting for actors who would never arrive. It wasn't until I reached the study that I saw it. The clock. It stood in the corner of the room, a tall grandfather clock with a face that shimmered faintly, as though it were covered in a thin layer of oil. The pendulum swung slowly, but its movement didn't match the ticking sound that filled the air. I stared at it, the hairs on my arms rising. The clock was wrong, though I couldn't have said why. Its numbers weren't Roman or Arabic, but something else entirely. Symbols that shifted when I looked too closely. And then it stopped. The pendulum froze mid-swing, and the ticking ceased. The silence that followed was unbearable, pressing against me like a physical weight. And then the house began to change. The walls shifted subtly at first, the angles bending in ways they shouldn't. The light from the windows dimmed further, the edges of the rooms blurring like a painting smeared with water. I turned to leave, but the door I'd come through was gone. Instead, the hallway stretched endlessly, the rooms on either side warping, their furniture shifting and melting into unrecognizable shapes. The air grew heavier, colder, carrying a faint sound now, a low hum, like a distant engine. At the far end of the hallway, something moved. It wasn't a person, but it had the shape of one, tall and thin. Its limbs stretched too far, its silhouette flickering faintly like an old film reel. It didn't walk toward me. It glided, the space around it bending as it moved. I stumbled back into the study, my pulse pounding in my ears. The clock stood silent, its pendulum still frozen. But the face of the clock had changed. The hands were spinning wildly now, faster than I could follow, the strange symbols blurring into streaks of light. The hum grew louder, filling the room, and I felt the floor shift beneath me. The house wasn't just changing, it was alive, and it wanted me here. The thing in the hallway was closer now, its flickering form blocking the doorway. Its face, or what passed for one, tilted slightly, as though studying me. I backed away, my hands fumbling against the desk behind me. My fingers brushed something cold and solid, a key. It wasn't like any key I'd seen before, its surface black and smooth, its teeth jagged and uneven. The moment I picked it up, the clock stopped spinning. The symbols on its face rearranged themselves into a single image, a door. Behind me, a panel in the wall slid open, revealing a narrow passageway. The hum turned into a roar as I ran, the hallway closing in around me. The walls twisted and warped, the air thick with the metallic tang of ozone. The passage ended abruptly, opening into a small room with a single door set into the far wall. The key fit perfectly. I turned it, and the roar of the house fell silent. The door opened into a blinding white light, and for a moment, I felt weightless, as though I'd stepped into nothingness. When I woke, I was back in my car, parked beneath the gnarled oak tree. The house was gone. The dirt road stretched ahead of me, untouched, the afternoon light warm and golden. But the key was still in my hand. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I hear the hum again. Waiting. The box arrived on my doorstep on the morning of the solar eclipse. It wasn't large, about the size of a shoebox, and it was wrapped in brown paper tied with a length of black string. No return address, no markings, not even my name scrawled across the surface. Just the box, sitting there in the pale light of the impending eclipse. I should have left it alone. But curiosity is a sharp thing, and it cut through me before I could think twice. I carried it inside, setting it on the kitchen table like an artifact from another world. It was heavier than I expected, and when I shook it gently, something shifted inside with a dull, resonant thud. I untied the string, the knot slipping loose with a single tug. The paper fell away, revealing a box made of dark, polished wood. Its surface was smooth, unnervingly so, as if it had been sanded by hands far more patient than mine. There was no latch, just a thin seam where the lid met the base. I hesitated, a flicker of unease tugging at my thoughts. Then I opened it. Inside was a sphere, no larger than an apple, its surface a deep, shimmering black. It wasn't glass or stone, something in between, perhaps, but it seemed to drink in the light rather than reflect it. Tiny specks of gold swirled within, shifting and pulsing like a heartbeat. And there was a note. It was folded neatly beneath the sphere, written on thick, yellowed paper in a hand, so precise it could have been printed. To see is to invite. To touch is to accept. Do not speak to it. Do not let it see you twice. I laughed nervously, though the sound felt thin and hollow in the quiet room. A prank, I thought, or an elaborate marketing gimmick. I folded the note, set it aside, and reached for the sphere. The moment my fingers brushed its surface, the room changed. The air grew heavier, pressing against my chest like a weight. Shadows deepened at the edges of my vision, shifting and twisting as though alive. The kitchen, the same one I'd eaten breakfast in just an hour ago, felt foreign, distorted. And then I saw it. The sphere had changed. Its surface was no longer smooth. It was rippling, small waves radiating outward as though something beneath it was stirring. The golden specks swirled faster, coalescing into shapes that were almost, but not quite, faces. My reflection appeared on its surface, faint and distorted, but it wasn't alone. Behind me stood a figure. I spun around, but the room was empty. When I turned back to the sphere, the figure was gone. The note's warnings echoed in my mind, but I couldn't make sense of them. To see is to invite? To touch is to accept? What had I invited? What had I accepted? The light in the room dimmed as the eclipse began, shadows stretching and pooling like spilled ink. I picked up the note again, scanning it for answers I hadn't noticed before. That's when I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like knuckles rapping against glass. It came from the window. The eclipse wasn't total yet, but the sky was darker than it should have been, an unnatural twilight casting the street in shades of gray. The tapping continued, faint but insistent, drawing my gaze toward the window. And there it was, the figure from the sphere. It stood just beyond the glass, its outline hazy and indistinct, as though it were part of the shadows themselves. Its head tilted slowly, unnaturally, as though studying me. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The tapping stopped. The figure raised a hand, pressing its palm against the glass. It left no mark, but I felt its presence, cold and invasive, as though it had reached into the room and touched the very air around me. The note's warning screamed in my mind. Do not speak to it. Do not let it see you twice. But how could I stop it from seeing me when it was already here? The figure tilted its head again, then stepped back, fading into the shadows as the eclipse reached its peak. I stared at the window, waiting for it to return, but the street was empty. When I turned back to the table, the sphere was gone. The box sat open, empty and silent, as though it had never held anything at all. The only thing left was the note, its words faintly smudged, as if touched by unseen hands. That night, I dreamed of the figure. It stood at the edge of my bed, its form more defined now, its features sharper. Its eyes were hollow, endless voids that seemed to pull at the edges of my mind. "You invited me," it whispered, its voice soft and layered, as though 100 voices spoke at once. I woke with a start, drenched in sweat. The room was dark, the silence thick and oppressive. The sphere was on my nightstand. The golden specks inside were gone, replaced by shapes I couldn't decipher, patterns that moved and shifted like living things. And on the floor, written in a fine layer of ash, was a single word: twice. I'd been in the new house for 3 days when the phone rang. It was one of those ancient rotary models, a decorative relic left behind by the previous owners. It sat in the corner of the living room, an odd little detail I'd ignored while unpacking. It wasn't plugged in. The cord dangled loose from the back, cut clean at the base. And yet, it rang. At first, I didn't move. The sound was jarring in the silence of the house, shrill and insistent, like an alarm that didn't belong. My phone sat untouched on the kitchen counter, the only device I trusted for calls. This, whatever it was, shouldn't have been possible. When I finally picked up the receiver, my hand trembled. I pressed it to my ear and said, "Hello?" There was no response, only static, faint and crackling, like the kind you'd hear on an old TV tuned to a dead channel. I waited, the seconds dragging into a silence that felt heavier than it should have. And then, just as I was about to hang up, a voice whispered through the line, "Are you safe?" I dropped the receiver. The sound of it hitting the floor echoed through the room, but I didn't pick it up again. Instead, I backed away, my pulse thundering in my ears. The static continued to hiss faintly from the earpiece, a relentless white noise that seemed to fill the entire house. Eventually, it stopped. The phone fell silent, and the air settled. I told myself it was a prank, some strange glitch, a leftover signal from God knows where. It didn't make sense, but what else could it be? Still, I couldn't stop thinking about the voice. It had been soft, almost pleading, and the question lingered in my mind long after I'd gone to bed. By morning, the incident had faded to the edges of my thoughts, replaced by the usual chaos of settling into a new place. The house was old, a fixer-upper I'd bought on impulse, charmed by its creaky floors and warped windows. It had character, the kind of history you could feel in your bones. But history came with quirks, and the quirks in this house were persistent. Doors didn't stay shut. I'd close the pantry only to find it open again minutes later. The taps in the bathroom would drip, no matter how tightly I turned the knobs. And there was the smell, faint, like burnt matches, that seemed to waft through the rooms without any discernible source. I chalked it up to the age of the house, the inevitable eccentricities of something built before modern conveniences. But on the fourth night, the phone rang again. This time, it woke me. The sound cut through the darkness, pulling me from a dream I couldn't quite remember. I sat up in bed, my chest tight, and stared at the faint glow of the hallway light seeping under my door. The phone rang again, its tone sharp and demanding. I didn't want to answer it. Every instinct screamed at me to leave it alone, to let it ring until it gave up. But the noise was unbearable, and eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I crept into the living room, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The phone sat exactly where I'd left it, the cut cord still dangling uselessly. My hand shook as I picked up the receiver. "Hello?" My voice was barely a whisper. For a moment, there was nothing, just the same static, soft and persistent, like waves lapping against the shore. And then, the voice returned. "You shouldn't be here." A chill raced down my spine. The tone was different this time, harsher, more urgent. "Who is this?" I demanded, my voice rising. "What do you want?" The static swelled, crackling loudly in my ear. I flinched, pulling the phone away, and when I did, the voice came through again, louder this time, clear and unmistakable. "Get out. Now." The line went dead. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the kitchen with every light on, clutching my cell phone and staring at the rotary phone as if it might spring to life again. It didn't, but the silence that filled the house was worse. Heavy. Watching. The next day, I called a repairman to check the wiring, even though I knew there was none. He looked at me like I was crazy when I explained the problem, but humored me anyway, pulling the phone apart and inspecting its insides. "It's not connected to anything," he said finally, holding the base up for me to see. "No power, no lines, nothing. This thing's as dead as they come." I forced a laugh, nodded, and thanked him. But when he left, I sat staring at the phone for a long time, my unease deepening. The third call came that evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air in the house felt colder than usual, and the burnt match smell had returned, stronger now, as if something was smoldering just out of sight. When the phone rang, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the receiver and shouted, "Who the hell is this?" The voice was calm this time, eerily composed. "It's not safe. You need to leave." I clenched my jaw, anger flaring through the fear. "Stop this. Whoever you are, just stop. I'm not leaving." The static grew louder, the sound almost deafening, and for a moment, I thought the voice was gone. But then it spoke again, softer now, almost sad. "It's already inside." The phone slipped from my hand, hitting the floor with a hollow thud. My breath came in shallow gasps as I scanned the room, every shadow suddenly alive with possibility. I grabbed my cell phone and called the only person I could think of, my friend, Claire. By the time she arrived, I was standing outside, barefoot and shivering in the driveway. I told her everything, every detail, expecting her to laugh or brush it off. But she didn't. She listened, her expression growing darker with every word. "You didn't read about the house before you bought it, did you?" she asked finally. I shook my head. "What are you talking about?" Claire hesitated, glancing back at the house. "There's a reason it was on the market so long. The last owners, something happened to them. They left in the middle of the night. Didn't even take their stuff. No one knows why." I stared at her, my mind racing. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't think you'd believe me," she said quietly. "We stayed at her place that night. I haven't gone back to the house since. I couldn't, even if I wanted to. Because last night, the rotary phone rang again. It was in my living room." The air in the office had a weight to it. Not the oppressive kind of tension that comes before a bad meeting or the stale quiet of a slow day, but something subtler, like the room itself was holding its breath. I noticed it the moment I walked in that morning. The hum of the fluorescent lights seemed sharper, the air colder, and the faint smell of burnt coffee lingered longer than usual. At first, I chalked it up to exhaustion. I'd been working late nights for weeks, trying to meet a deadline that never seemed to get closer no matter how much I chipped away at it. But the feeling clung to me, and by the time lunch rolled around, I couldn't shake the sense that something was off. The office wasn't large, just a single floor of cubicles and meeting rooms, with a break area shoved into one corner. On a normal day, it was filled with the usual noise of office life. Keyboards clacking, phones ringing, muffled conversations. Today, though, everything was muted, like the building itself was trying to dampen sound. And then there were the people. They were there, of course. My coworkers sat at their desks, heads bent over their screens, or huddled in the break room, sipping coffee. But they weren't right. Linda, who sat 2 desks away, usually greeted me with a cheery "good morning" and a smile. Today, she just nodded, her face blank, her eyes fixed on her monitor as if it held the answers to some unspoken question. James, the office joker, didn't crack a single joke all morning. He just sat in his chair, staring at the same spreadsheet for hours. By mid-afternoon, I realized no one had moved from their desks. Not for coffee, not for the bathroom, not even to stretch. I tried to shake it off, to convince myself I was imagining things, but the unease in my chest grew heavier. Around 3 o'clock, I decided I needed a break. I grabbed my coat and headed for the elevator, eager for even 5 minutes of fresh air. The doors slid open, and I stepped inside, pressing the button for the lobby. The elevator didn't move. The button didn't light up, and when I pressed it again, harder this time, nothing happened. I jabbed at other buttons, floors, the emergency call button, but the elevator stayed stubbornly still. With a sigh, I stepped back out into the hallway, intending to take the stairs. But the hallway wasn't the same. The row of cubicles that had been visible from the elevator was gone, replaced by a blank stretch of wall. The familiar hum of the office was muted further, replaced by an eerie stillness. I turned back toward the elevator, but the doors had closed, and the call button no longer responded. "Hello?" I called, my voice breaking the silence. No one answered. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps echoing unnaturally loud against the floor. The building seemed larger somehow, its angles sharper, the air colder. The further I went, the more I noticed the walls changing. At first, it was subtle, a shift in the color of the paint, a faint crack in the plaster that hadn't been there before. But soon, the walls began to warp, their surfaces rippling like the skin of some vast, breathing creature. I turned a corner and found myself in a room I didn't recognize. It wasn't an office space. The walls were bare, their surfaces smooth and gleaming faintly in the dim light. A single chair sat in the center of the room, its back to me. "Hello?" I called again, my voice trembling. The chair creaked, shifting slightly, and for a moment, I thought someone was sitting in it. But when I stepped closer, I saw it was empty. On the seat was a piece of paper, folded neatly. I hesitated before picking it up. The paper felt cold and damp, as though it had been pulled from the depths of a dark pool. I unfolded it slowly, my hands trembling. "You don't belong here." The words were written in neat, looping handwriting I didn't recognize. The lights flickered overhead, and the air seemed to grow thicker, pressing against my chest. The hum returned, louder now, a deep, resonant vibration that made my teeth ache. I turned to leave the room, but the hallway was gone. In its place was a staircase, spiraling downward into darkness. I didn't want to go. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to find another way out, but there was nowhere else to go. The stairs groaned under my weight as I descended, the sound swallowed by the thick, pulsing silence. The air grew colder the deeper I went, and the walls around me seemed to close in, their surfaces glistening faintly as though slick with moisture. At the bottom of the stairs was another door. It was massive, its surface etched with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when I looked at them too long. The handle was smooth and cold, and as my hand closed around it, I felt a faint vibration beneath my fingers. I opened the door. The room beyond was vast, its edges lost in shadow. In the center stood a single figure, tall and motionless. It wasn't a person. It looked like one, at first glance, but its proportions were wrong. Its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its face was featureless, a smooth expanse of pale skin that reflected the faint light. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The figure tilted its head further, as if studying me. Then, slowly, it raised a hand and pointed. Behind me. I turned, my breath catching in my throat. The doorway I'd come through was gone. In its place was a mirror, its surface rippling like water. And in the reflection, I saw myself. But it wasn't me. My reflection smiled, its lips curling too wide, its eyes dark and empty. I stumbled back, my hands shaking, and when I turned to face the figure again, it was gone. The room was gone. I was back in the office, sitting at my desk. Everything looked normal. The hum of fluorescent lights, the soft clatter of keyboards, the distant murmur of conversation. But when I glanced at my reflection in the darkened screen of my monitor, it smiled. I didn't. The road to LeClaire's Hollow didn't appear on GPS. I'd heard about the place from an old coworker, one of those people who seemed to collect bizarre trivia and urban legends like trading cards. "It's not haunted," she'd said over lunch, stirring her coffee with a spoon far too long for the tiny cup. "Not exactly. It's just wrong. People who go there see things they can't explain." I wasn't a believer in the supernatural, but the story stuck with me. Something about her tone, the way her eyes had darted away as if she didn't want to talk about it but couldn't stop herself, lingered like the scent of smoke after a fire. Months later, when I found myself with a rare free weekend and a restless energy I couldn't shake, I decided to find it. The directions were vague. Take Highway 16 west until the last gas station, then follow the dirt road beside it for 7 miles. No signs, no markers. Just an unassuming stretch of forest and a town that wasn't on any map. The dirt road was worse than I expected. Rutted and narrow, flanked by trees that leaned too close. The kind of road where you start to question if you missed a turn, or if you're even supposed to be there. I was about to give up when the forest thinned, and I saw the first house. If you could call it that. It was more of a structure than a home. Its walls leaning precariously inward, the roof sagging as if under the weight of too many years. The windows were shattered, their jagged edges catching the weak afternoon light like teeth. The rest of the town wasn't much better. LeClaire's Hollow was little more than a collection of crumbling buildings arranged in a rough circle around a dry, cracked fountain. A rusted plaque at its base bore the town's name, the letters faded but still legible. There was no sound, no birds, no insects, not even the wind. Just the oppressive stillness that presses against your eardrums and makes your own breathing seem too loud. I parked near the fountain, hesitating for a moment before stepping out. The air was heavy, carrying a faint metallic tang that made me think of old coins or blood. I wandered the town, peering into broken windows and through warped doorways. The buildings were empty, stripped bare of anything that might have hinted at the lives once lived here. No furniture, no personal belongings, just walls stained with time and floors scattered with debris. In one house, I found a table with a single chair pulled up to it. A plate sat in the center, its surface coated in a fine layer of dust. Next to it was a knife and fork, perfectly aligned. The place felt staged, as though it were waiting for someone to sit down. I left quickly, my skin crawling. The farther I explored, the more I noticed the marks. At first, I thought they were graffiti. Strange, looping symbols scratched into walls, etched into wooden beams, even carved into the dirt beneath my feet. But they weren't random. The lines were too deliberate, too precise, spiraling inwards like a drain. I tried to ignore them, but they seemed to be everywhere. By the time I reached the edge of town, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows that stretched unnaturally far. And then I saw her. She stood at the far end of the street, just beyond the last house. A girl, no older than 12, wearing a faded dress that hung loosely on her thin frame. Her hair was tangled, and her face was pale, almost gray, as though the blood had drained from it. She didn't move. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. She tilted her head, watching me with eyes that were too wide, too dark. "Are you lost?" I tried again, taking a cautious step toward her. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. And then she was gone. Not like she ran or ducked into a house, just gone, as though she'd never been there. I backed away, my pulse hammering in my ears, and nearly tripped over the edge of the fountain. The dry basin was no longer empty. A single coin lay at the center, its surface polished to a gleaming, unnatural shine. I didn't remember seeing it before, and something about it made my stomach twist. As I bent down to look closer, I heard the sound. It was faint at first, a soft hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. But it grew louder, vibrating through the ground beneath my feet. The symbols carved into the fountain's base began to glow, faint at first but quickly growing brighter, their light pulsing in time with the hum. I stumbled back, my instincts screaming at me to run, but my legs felt heavy, as though the air itself had thickened around me. The hum grew into a low, resonant note, and the symbols on the fountain shifted. They weren't just carvings anymore. They were moving, writhing like living things, their spirals reaching outward, twisting and curling toward me. I ran. The town blurred around me, the buildings leaning closer, their shadows stretching impossibly long. The dirt road stretched endlessly ahead, the trees on either side twisting in on themselves like they were trying to block my escape. When I finally burst out of the forest, gasping for air, my car was gone. The town was gone. I stood on the side of an empty road, the forest behind me silent and still. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined the whole thing. Then I looked at my hand. A single coin rested in my palm, its surface gleaming unnaturally bright. And when I turned it over, I saw the symbol. A spiral, etched deep into the metal, its lines shifting and twisting as though it were alive. I don't know how I got back home. but the hum is still with me. And every night, I dream of the town. Or maybe I'm still there. I bought the house for its potential, not for what it was. It was a classic fixer-upper. Peeling paint, creaky floors, and a backyard overrun with weeds. But it had charm, the kind that whispers promises to people like me who think they can bring anything back to life. The house had been vacant for years, though no one could tell me exactly why. The neighbors offered vague comments about the previous owners leaving in a hurry, but they were quick to change the subject, as if lingering on it might invite something back. The first few weeks were uneventful, full of trips to the hardware store and long nights with sandpaper and paint cans. It wasn't until I started clearing out the attic that things began to feel different. The space was packed with the kind of junk you'd expect in an old house. Yellowed newspapers, a broken rocking chair, boxes filled with holiday decorations from decades past. But at the far end, tucked beneath a faded sheet, was something unexpected. It was a mirror. The frame was ornate, carved from dark wood that felt cold to the touch. Its surface was tarnished, cloudy, with faint streaks running across the glass like veins. Despite its condition, the mirror had an unsettling allure, the kind that made it impossible to look away. I stood there for a long moment, staring into its murky depths, before dragging it downstairs and propping it against the living room wall. I told myself it was just temporary, that I'd figure out what to do with it later. But something about the mirror felt rooted, as if it belonged there more than I did. That night, I noticed the first change. It was subtle at first, something I only caught in my peripheral vision. As I walked past the mirror on my way to bed, I thought I saw movement, just a flicker, like someone stepping out of view. I stopped, staring at my reflection, but everything seemed normal. Just me, exhausted and covered in paint splatters. I went to bed convincing myself it was the result of too many late nights and too much coffee. But as the days went on, the flickers became harder to dismiss. The mirror seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. Its glass grew clearer in certain moments, sharper, as though it were waiting for something or someone. Once, as I passed by with a laundry basket in hand, I could have sworn I saw a shadow behind me, faint and fleeting. I spun around, my heart racing, but the room was empty. The strangest part wasn't what I saw. It was how the house began to feel. The air grew heavier, charged, like the moments before a storm. The creaks and groans of the old wood floors became more deliberate, their rhythms almost like footsteps. One evening, as I sat on the couch scrolling through my phone, I heard a faint tapping. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and coming from the mirror. I froze, my body going cold, every instinct screaming at me not to look. But curiosity is a dangerous thing. The glass wasn't reflecting the room anymore. Instead, it showed something else entirely. A hallway that didn't belong to my house. It was long and narrow, its walls lined with dark wood paneling, lit by a single flickering bulb at the far end. My reflection was gone. I stepped closer, the tapping growing louder with each step, until I was standing directly in front of the mirror. The hallway stretched endlessly before me, but there was something else now. A figure. It was distant at first, just a smudge of movement at the edge of the light. But as I watched, it grew closer. The figure was tall, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It moved slowly, deliberately, its bare feet silent on the wooden floor. I stumbled back, my pulse thundering in my ears. The mirror's surface rippled, as if the figure had pressed against it from the other side. For a moment, I thought it might step through, but then the tapping stopped. The hallway disappeared, and my reflection returned, pale and wide-eyed, staring back at me. That night, I dragged the mirror into the garage, throwing an old sheet over it. I told myself that was the end of it, that whatever strange pull it had over the house would fade now that it was out of sight. I was wrong. The house grew colder, the air more oppressive. Doors that I was sure I'd closed swung open on their own. Lights flickered no matter how often I replaced the bulbs. The sounds became louder. Footsteps, faint whispers, the tapping that seemed to follow me from room to room. And then the mirror came back. I found it in the hallway one morning, the sheet crumpled on the floor beside it. Its surface was clearer than ever, the glass almost glowing in the dim light. This time, I didn't need to move closer to see what it showed. The hallway was there again, more vivid, more real. The figure was waiting at the end, its head tilted in the same unnatural way, its hollow eyes fixed on me. It raised a hand and tapped on the glass, 3 slow, deliberate knocks. This time, I didn't run. I couldn't. Something pulled me forward, my body moving without permission, my fingers brushing against the cold surface of the mirror. The glass rippled like water, and before I could pull away, it swallowed me whole. The hallway was colder than I expected. The air was thick and damp, the flickering light above casting shadows that moved even when I didn't. The figure stood just a few feet away now, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. "Why did you bring me here?" I whispered, though I didn't expect an answer. The figure tilted its head further, the motion slow and deliberate. "You brought yourself," it said, its voice like a rustle of dead leaves. The hallway stretched endlessly behind it, lined with more mirrors. In each one, I saw fragments of myself, moving, screaming, crying, trapped in reflections that didn't match my movements. The figure stepped closer, its hand outstretched, its fingers impossibly long. "You can stay," it said, "or you can bring someone else." I woke up on the floor of my living room, the mirror standing upright against the wall. Its surface was blank again, cloudy and tarnished, but I knew better. Now, every time someone visits, I catch them glancing at the mirror, their eyes lingering too long. They always comment on it, asking where I found it, why I keep it around. I just smile and say, it's part of the house. But sometimes, when I'm alone, I see the figure's reflection in the glass, waiting patiently for me to decide. The last time I saw my sister, she was standing on the edge of the lake, her back to me. Her red jacket was bright against the gray morning fog, the water so still it looked like glass. She didn't turn around when I called her name. She didn't even flinch. I remember feeling the chill of the damp air creeping into my skin as I called her again. Louder this time. Still nothing. I walked toward her, the wet grass soft under my sneakers, but as I reached out to grab her shoulder, she stepped into the water. Not in a panicked way, like she was trying to drown herself, but calmly, deliberately. "Erin," I shouted, lunging to pull her back, but my fingers just brushed her sleeve as she sank beneath the surface. And then she was gone. The search lasted 3 days. The police dragged the lake. Divers combed every inch of the murky water. They found nothing. No footprints. No clothes. Not even her jacket. It was as if she had simply disappeared. I told them everything I could. How we'd been hiking that morning. How she'd seemed fine, normal, even happy. How one minute she was standing beside me on the trail, and the next she was walking toward the lake like something was calling her. Nobody believed me. She probably got lost, they said. Or worse, maybe she wanted to disappear. But I knew Erin. She wasn't the type to vanish, to give up, to walk into a lake and never come out. The first time I heard her voice after she disappeared, I thought I was dreaming. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, the weight of her absence pressing down on me. Then, faintly, I heard it. "Adam." I sat up, my heart pounding. It wasn't a scream or a cry for help. It was soft, almost gentle, like she was calling to me from another room. "Erin?" I whispered. The voice didn't come again. The second time, I was outside, standing by the lake. The water was as still as it had been the day she vanished, reflecting the pale gray sky. I was about to turn back when I heard it again, clearer this time. "Adam." I froze. The voice wasn't coming from behind me or from the trees. It was coming from the lake. I stepped closer, peering into the dark water. For a moment, I thought I saw something. A flash of red, a shape moving just beneath the surface. But when I blinked, it was gone. That night, I had the dream. In it, I was standing at the edge of the lake, the moon high above, casting its reflection across the water. Erin was there, standing in the shallows. Her red jacket was soaked, clinging to her thin frame, her hair plastered to her face. "Come here," she said, her voice soft but insistent. I couldn't move. "Please, Adam," she said again. "I need you to see." "See what?" I asked. But before she could answer, the lake swallowed her whole. I woke up gasping, my sheets damp with sweat. Over the next few days, the voice grew stronger. I heard it when I was brushing my teeth, when I was in the car, when I walked past the lake on my way to work. It was always the same. Adam, come here. Come see. I couldn't ignore it anymore. That night, I went back to the lake. The air was colder than it should have been, and the moon hung low, casting an eerie silver light over the water. Aaron? I called out, my voice shaking. The lake rippled. I stepped closer, the damp earth soft beneath my feet. And then I saw her. She was standing in the middle of the lake, her red jacket glowing faintly in the moonlight. Her face was pale, her eyes dark, but it was her. Aaron! I shouted. She didn't respond. Instead, she raised one hand and pointed. Not at me, but at the water. See, she said. I didn't understand. Aaron, what are you? See. Her voice echoed, louder now, reverberating across the still water. I took a step forward, my shoes sinking into the muddy shore. The water was cold, biting against my ankles as I waded in. And then I saw it. The reflection in the water wasn't mine. It looked like me, same face, same clothes, but the expression was wrong. Its eyes were wide. Its mouth twisted into a grin that didn't belong to me. See, Aaron said again, her voice distant, almost mechanical. The reflection moved, raising its hand to wave at me, even though I hadn't moved. My stomach churned, and I stumbled back, nearly falling into the water. When I looked up, Aaron was gone. The lake was empty, but the reflection was still there. It smiled wider, its teeth sharp and impossibly white, before it sank beneath the surface, disappearing into the depths. I ran. I don't go near the lake anymore. I don't listen to the voice when it calls. But every now and then, when I pass a mirror or catch my reflection in a window, I see it, the other version of me, just for a second, smiling that same too wide smile. And somewhere in the distance, I hear her voice again. Come see. The sky above the park had a way of pulling your gaze, the way it seemed larger there, unbroken by buildings or wires. I'd come to the park every day after work, more out of habit than any real need for fresh air, and sit on the same weathered bench near the fountain. It wasn't much, just a worn stretch of wood with chipping paint, but it faced the water, and I liked the quiet. That Tuesday evening, the park felt different. The air was dense, like the wait before a summer storm, though the sky was clear. The usual crowd, joggers, kids on bikes, the elderly man feeding pigeons, was gone. The fountain burbled as usual, but the sound felt muted, as though the water was falling through something heavier than air. And then there was the man. I noticed him standing at the edge of the clearing, near the path that led to the woods. He was too far to make out clearly, but something about his posture struck me as wrong. He wasn't leaning or shifting his weight, just standing perfectly still, as if carved from stone. At first, I tried to ignore him. It wasn't unusual to see someone lingering near the woods, teenagers smoking, dog walkers letting their pets explore, but the longer I sat, the harder it was to look away. His stillness was unnatural, unnerving. I decided to leave early, brushing off the prickling unease creeping up my spine. But as I stood, I realized the man had moved. He was closer now, not walking, not running, just closer, as though the space between us had rearranged itself while I wasn't looking. I froze, my hand gripping the edge of the bench. His face was still in shadow, but I could see enough to know he was looking directly at me. A soft breeze stirred the trees, carrying with it a faint, metallic tang. The air felt heavier still, pressing against my chest, and for the first time, I noticed how silent the park had become. Even the fountain seemed quieter, its rhythm dampened. "Can I help you?" I called, my voice shaky but loud enough to carry. The man didn't respond. He didn't move. The shadows around him began to shift. I couldn't tell if it was the trees swaying or the dim light playing tricks on me, but the darkness around him seemed alive, curling and stretching like tendrils of smoke. Then he took a step. It was deliberate, too smooth, as though he'd been slid forward rather than walking. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I turned and walked quickly toward the park's exit, my heart racing. The air grew colder with each step, the metallic tang sharpening, and I had the distinct feeling that I wasn't alone. I glanced over my shoulder and stopped in my tracks. The man wasn't behind me. He was ahead, standing just beyond the gate, blocking the exit, his figure silhouetted against the street lights. "How?" I started, but my voice faltered. The shadows around him were darker now, thick and pulsating, obscuring the details of his face. He tilted his head slightly, like a predator studying its prey. I stepped back, my mind scrambling for another way out. The park wasn't large, but the woods behind the fountain were dense enough to offer some cover. Without thinking, I turned and ran toward them, branches scratching at my arms as I pushed through the underbrush. The woods were darker than they should have been. The sun hadn't set yet, but beneath the canopy, the light seemed to vanish entirely, leaving me stumbling through shadows. And then I heard it, a sound like static, faint but growing louder, crackling in the air around me. It wasn't coming from any direction in particular, just everywhere, seeping into my ears, vibrating through my chest. I tripped over a root and fell hard, the ground damp and cold beneath me. When I looked up, the man was standing just a few feet away. The static grew deafening as he stepped closer, the shadows around him writhing like living things. I scrambled backward, my hands slipping in the mud. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice barely audible over the noise. He stopped, his head tilting again. "You saw me," he said, his voice a low, layered hum that felt more like pressure than sound. "I didn't." "You saw me," he repeated, and with those words, the static stopped. The silence was worse. The air felt like it had been sucked out of the forest, leaving a vacuum behind. My vision blurred, the edges of the world rippling, and for a moment, it felt as though I were underwater. The man knelt slowly, bringing his face level with mine. "You shouldn't have looked," he said. His face shifted, blurred, as though it couldn't hold its shape. I closed my eyes, squeezing them shut so tightly it hurt. When I opened them again, he was gone. I was sitting on the bench, the fountain burbling softly in front of me. The sun was just beginning to set, the park filled with its usual sounds, laughter, footsteps, birds in the trees. But the air still felt heavy, and when I looked toward the woods, the shadows were too dark. I haven't gone back to the park since, but every night, I hear the static. The first time I noticed the numbers, they were scrawled on a napkin at the coffee shop near my office. I'd gone there for my usual order, a large black coffee, no sugar, and had settled into my favorite corner booth to check emails. The napkin was already on the table, crumpled and stained with what looked like grease. At first, I thought it was random, a series of numbers written in a looping, messy hand. But something about them caught my attention. 416, 45.2213 to 122.6784. I stared at the coordinates, curious. Maybe someone had been doodling, or maybe it was the start of a puzzle left behind by a bored customer. I pulled up the coordinates on my phone. They pointed to a spot just outside the city, a small wooded area about 20 miles away. I didn't think much of it until I noticed the napkin wasn't stained. The grease wasn't grease. It was blood. My breath caught in my throat, but when I looked again, the napkin was pristine, clean. The numbers were still there, but the stain was gone. I threw the napkin away and left, trying to shake the feeling that something was off. The numbers stayed with me. That night, I couldn't sleep. The coordinates played over and over in my mind, refusing to let go. By midnight, I'd made up my mind. I grabbed my jacket, got in my car, and drove to the location. The woods were darker than I expected, even with the glow of the city behind me. My flashlight barely cut through the gloom as I followed the GPS. The path wound deeper into the trees, the air growing colder, quieter. And then I saw it. A second set of numbers, scratched into the bark of a tree. 233, 40.7, 128 to 74.0060. New York City. My heart raced as I copied the numbers into my phone. They didn't make sense. What did these times and places mean? And why were they here, in the middle of nowhere? The sound of snapping twigs made me turn sharply, but the woods were still. Too still. I didn't stay long after that. The next day, the numbers followed me. They were on the back of my receipt at the gas station, written in the same looping hand. They appeared on a sticky note at my desk, though I hadn't written it. By evening, they showed up on my bathroom mirror, traced in the fog after my shower. I tried to ignore them, but they kept coming. New coordinates, new times, and the times were always in the future. The next set was only a few hours away. 8:17, 51.507, 4 to 0.1278. London. I didn't have time to get there, obviously, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. What would happen at 8:17 in London? Why was I being shown these places? When the time passed, the news answered my question. At exactly 8:17 p.m. London time, a train derailed in the city center. 37 people were injured. 2 died. My stomach churned. The numbers weren't random. The next set appeared that night, scribbled on a page of a book I hadn't touched in years. 342, 48.8566 to 2.3522. Paris. This time, I couldn't ignore it. I called the police, tried to explain what I'd found, but they didn't take me seriously. I couldn't blame them. It sounded insane, even to me. When 342 came, a fire broke out in an apartment complex in Paris. 5 people didn't make it. I didn't sleep that night. The numbers kept coming, each one etched into my life in ways I couldn't escape. On my coffee cup, in the condensation on my car window, once, on the underside of my pillow. Each time, they predicted another disaster. I started to wonder, was I supposed to stop them? Was that the point? But how? I couldn't predict what would happen or how to intervene, and every attempt to warn someone ended in failure. And then, the numbers changed. They weren't coordinates anymore. They were addresses. The first one was local, a house on the other side of town. The time was only an hour away. I drove there, desperate to understand what was happening. The house was dark, its windows blank and lifeless. I knocked, but no one answered. And then, as the clock struck the given time, the smell of smoke hit me. Flames erupted from the back of the house, spreading too quickly to be natural. I called 911, but by the time the fire department arrived, the house was gone. The next set of numbers was my own address. The time was midnight. I didn't wait to see what would happen. I left, driving aimlessly through the night, my phone buzzing incessantly with new messages. Each one contained numbers. Each one was closer. And then the final message came, written not on paper, not on glass, but carved into the inside of my car's windshield. Now, the car engine sputtered and died. The lights flickered, and the numbers disappeared. The clock on the wall was running backward. I didn't notice it at first. I was too distracted, sitting at my usual booth in the diner, staring at my half-empty coffee cup while the low murmur of other patrons filled the air. It wasn't until the waitress set my refill down and glanced at the clock herself that she frowned. "Is that new?" she asked, her voice uncertain. I looked up. The hands of the clock ticked in reverse, second by second, moving steadily counterclockwise. It wasn't broken. The hands moved smoothly, with no stutter or hesitation. "I don't think so," I replied, my stomach tightening for reasons I couldn't quite explain. She hesitated, watching the clock for a moment longer, then shook her head. "Maybe it's just one of those days," she muttered before walking away. But it wasn't just one of those days. As I left the diner and stepped into the cool evening air, I noticed other oddities. The neon sign for the convenience store down the street flickered, spelling its name backward. The digital clock on the bank flashed an impossible hour, 72:13 p.m. I stopped walking, the hairs on my arms prickling. The world felt disjointed. The usual hum of the city, the blend of voices and distant traffic, was softer now, muted like someone had turned the volume down. The air carried a faint metallic tang, sharp and unnatural, and the streetlights cast long, warped shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. When I got home, my apartment felt colder than it should have been. I locked the door behind me and stood in the entryway, trying to shake the strange unease that had followed me from the diner. Everything looked normal. The couch where I'd left my jacket, the coffee table stacked with unread mail, but the air was heavy, the kind of stillness that made every creak of the floorboards feel like a shout. I turned on the TV, hoping for some background noise, but every channel was static. I reached for my phone, only to find it wasn't in my pocket. I could have sworn I'd had it when I left the diner, but maybe I'd left it on the counter. The knock came just as I was about to head back out. 3 slow, deliberate raps against the door. I froze, my hand hovering over the doorknob. My first instinct was to check the peephole, but something about the knock made me hesitate. It was too steady, too practiced, as though whoever, or whatever, was on the other side knew I'd answer. The knock came again, louder this time. I stepped back, heart pounding, and glanced at the window. The blinds were drawn, but the faint light from the street lamps outside cast thin lines across the floor. "Who is it?" I called, my voice sounding small in the silence. No answer. The doorknob turned slowly, the mechanism clicking softly as it rotated. I bolted to the kitchen, grabbing the first thing my hand landed on, a heavy ceramic mug. When I turned back, the door was ajar, its edge just barely brushing the frame. The hallway beyond was dark. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the sliver of blackness beyond the door, my pulse thundering in my ears. Nothing moved. No sound came from the hall. Finally, I stepped forward, my makeshift weapon raised, and nudged the door open with my foot. The hallway was empty, but on the floor, just inside the doorway, was my phone. It shouldn't have been there. I hadn't dropped it, hadn't taken it out of my pocket since leaving the diner. The screen lit up as I picked it up. One new notification. One missed call from unknown. The time of the call read midnight. I stared at the screen, my breath catching in my throat, and swiped to check my recent calls. The list was blank. The lights flickered, and then the clock on the wall began ticking backward. At first, it was slow, the hands jerking in uneven movements, but within seconds, it sped up, spinning wildly as though time itself was unraveling. The air around me grew colder, the metallic tang sharper now, and the shadows in the room stretched unnaturally, pooling together like spilled ink. My phone buzzed in my hand. Another notification. "Come see." The words burned on the screen, glowing brighter than they should have, and then the phone shut off, the screen going black. Something moved in the corner of the room. I didn't see it directly, just the suggestion of movement, the faint shift of shadows where there shouldn't have been any. And then, faintly, I heard the knock again. This time, it was coming from inside the apartment. I turned slowly, the mug in my hand feeling absurdly useless, and saw the door to my bedroom. It was open now, the darkness beyond it deeper than I remembered. The knock came again, louder this time, from somewhere inside the room. The air pressed against my chest, heavy and suffocating, and the light from the living room dimmed, the shadows crawling closer. I stepped toward the bedroom, my heart pounding so hard it hurt, and peered inside. The bed was untouched. The dresser, the nightstand, everything was as I'd left it. But in the middle of the floor was a single sheet of paper. I picked it up with trembling hands, and the words written there burned themselves into my mind. "You're running out of time." The knock came again, directly behind me. When I turned, the clock on the wall was gone. The only sound was the relentless ticking, louder and louder, until it filled my head, drowning out everything else. And then there was nothing. No sound, no light, just the endless, impossible pull of time unraveling around me. And I understood, too late, that the knock had never come from outside.